Every great catastrophe in Game of Thrones, every severed head, every poisoned cup, every widow's cry across the ruins of the Seven Kingdoms traces back in some way to one small man with a mocking smile and a finger perpetually raised to test the direction of the wind. Not the dragons, not the Night King, not Cersei's spite or Joffrey's cruelty. Petyr Baelish, Littlefinger, the man born with nothing, who decided that if he couldn't own the game, he would simply set it on fire and sell tickets to the blaze. You've watched him, you've smirked at his quips, you've watched him die. But here's the thing most viewers never fully grasped. By the time Petyr Baelish appears in the very first scene of Game of Thrones, he had already won. The war hadn't started, the Starks hadn't been destroyed, the realm hadn't been torn apart, but Littlefinger had already pulled the first domino, years earlier, in silence, without a single drop of blood on his own hands. This is the story of a man who understood something that no king, no general, no dragon rider in Westeros ever did, that the most dangerous weapon in any world isn't steel or fire, it's information, it's desire. It's the ability to see what people want and use it against them before they've even admitted it to themselves. This is the story of a boy who was mocked, nearly killed, and dismissed as irrelevant, and who responded by orchestrating the single greatest geopolitical catastrophe in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. You think you know Littlefinger. You don't. Not even close. There is a moment in Season 1, Episode 4, Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things, where Petyr Baelish is standing in the throne room at King's Landing, watching Ned Stark work through the implications of Jon Arryn's death. And the look on his face is almost sorrowful. Not guilty, not triumphant, sorrowful. It is the look of a man who genuinely respects the quality of what he is about to destroy. Most people watching that scene read it as atmosphere, atmospheric menace, mysterious Littlefinger, lurking, scheming. But when you know the full story, when you understand where this man came from, what happened to him, what it cost him to become the thing he became, that expression is the most devastating detail in the entire episode, because it tells you something the show never says out loud. Petyr Baelish did not want to burn the world. He wanted to belong to it. He just concluded, a long time before that scene, that belonging was never going to be an option. But here's the thing. We watch Game of Thrones and we absorb Littlefinger through his surface, the smirk, the schemes, the brothels, the finger raised to the wind opportunism. We hear him say chaos is a ladder, and we file him under a clever villain, and we move on. What we miss, what most viewers missed entirely, is that everything Littlefinger ever did traces back to a very specific wound, a very specific moment of humiliation, a very specific boy in a very specific courtyard who made one catastrophic decision that restructured the rest of his life. This chapter is about that wound, where it came from, what it did to him, and why the entire War of the Five Kings, every corpse, every burning village, every widow screaming into the rubble, flows from one small boy who fell in love with the wrong girl. Let me walk you through it. To understand Petyr Baelish, you have to understand the specific texture of his humiliation. And I want to be precise here because this is important. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was the quiet, grinding, daily humiliation of being reminded again and again, in small ways and large, that you don't belong. He was born on the Fingers. If you're unfamiliar with the geography, the Fingers are a cluster of rocky, wind-swept promontories along the northeastern coast of the Vale of Arryn. Austere, remote, the kind of place that sounds poetic on a map and is deeply unpleasant to actually live on. The Baelish family seat was a tiny tower on the smallest of those peninsulas, which Petyr would later contemptuously nickname the Drearfort. No grand castle, no extensive lands, no storied military history. The kind of holding that technically qualifies as nobility and is in every practical sense irrelevant. But here is the detail that breaks my brain every time I think about it. His great-grandfather had been a Braavosi sellsword, a mercenary from across the narrow sea who came to the continent on a job and simply stayed. He liked the place, apparently, or couldn't afford the voyage home, or married someone. The family were essentially immigrant laborers who had clawed their way up to the very lowest rung of the nobility over 3 generations. The original Baelish sigil was the Titan of Braavos, not a Westerosi symbol, a foreign one. The great colossus of a city across the sea that most Westerosi lords had never visited. Imagine every formal occasion, every heraldic display, every moment when sigils were the visible language of identity and belonging, and the Baelish family was flying a flag that said, "We are from somewhere else." Petyr would eventually replace that sigil with silver mockingbirds on green. And I want to sit with that choice for a second, because it is not a random aesthetic decision. The mockingbird, a creature that mimics others, survives entirely through imitation and adaptation, has no song of its own, but an extraordinary ear for every song around it, and never stops. It never stops singing, never stops adapting, never stops finding a way to be heard. That is the emblem Petyr Baelish chose for himself. That is how he understood his own survival strategy by the time he was old enough to commission a sigil. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Lord Hoster Tully, perhaps doing a minor lord a minor favor, the kind of easy charitable gesture that powerful men make without giving much thought to, agreed to foster young Petyr at Riverrun. This was a fairly common arrangement in Westeros, noble houses sending their children to be raised in the households of greater lords, building alliances, learning courtly behavior, acquiring the polish that the provinces couldn't provide. For Petyr Baelish, it meant leaving the smallest rock in the Vale and arriving at one of the great seats of Westeros, Riverrun, the ancestral home of House Tully, seat of the Lord of the Riverlands, a castle at the confluence of 3 rivers, surrounded by water and by history and by the particular easy confidence of people who have always had things. And in that household were Lord Hoster's children, Catelyn, Lysa, and Edmure. He was small, he was slender, he was always the shortest one in the room. I want you to hold that image, the boy from the smallest finger of the Vale, standing in a hall full of children who had grown up in that hall, who knew every servant by name, who had never had to wonder whether they belonged. He was not unkind necessarily, but he was visibly, undeniably out of place, the kind of out of place that other children can smell. And Edmure Tully, heir to Riverrun, bred into comfort, started calling him Littlefinger, small boy from the small fingers. It stuck with the particular cruelty that only childhood mockery achieves. It followed him from Riverrun to Goldtown to King's Landing to the highest councils of the realm. By the time he was the third most powerful man in Westeros, lords who feared him were still calling him Littlefinger behind his back, not because they didn't respect him, because the name had calcified into the culture and nobody thought to stop. That's the wound you can name. What Peter almost certainly never named, what he probably couldn't name because it was too large and too close, was the other thing that happened at Riverrun. He fell in love with Catelyn Tully. Not a passing crush, not adolescent infatuation. Devotion. The kind of love that happens in adolescence when you're isolated and intelligent and the person across the courtyard is warm and beautiful and entirely unaware of your existence in the way that matters. He watched her. He orbited her, the way small bodies orbit larger ones, pulled by gravity they didn't choose and couldn't escape, exerting almost no measurable pull of their own. He listened to her argue with her father. He observed the way she moved through that castle like she owned it, because she essentially did, with the unearned confidence of people born to their place. And Catelyn, kind, well-meaning, genuinely not a cruel person, treated him like a little brother, a household fixture. Sweet Peter with his clever eyes and his slightly uncomfortable silences. She was fond of him the way you're fond of someone who's always just there, a comfortable part of the landscape. She never saw what he felt, or if she saw it, she chose not to see it, because engaging with it would have been complicated and generous, and she was busy being the Lord's daughter, which is a full-time occupation. There's a line, and I want you to hear it with full knowledge of everything that comes after. Season 4, Episode 7, Mockingbird, the scene in the Eyrie right before Lysa Arryn dies. Peter says to Lysa, "I have only loved one woman, only one, my entire life." He's not talking to Lysa. He is standing next to Lysa, who has loved him obsessively since childhood, who poisoned her own husband because he asked her to, who has given him everything. And he is telling her in this moment that all of it, every shred of devotion she poured into him for 40 years, was always and only about her sister. Read that again. He says it with complete calm, no cruelty in his voice, just the flat truth of it, delivered because he has passed the point where the pretense serves any purpose. And what it reveals about him, what has always been true about him, running beneath every scheme and every smirk and every perfectly calculated manipulation, is that the wound was never about status, it was never about power. It was about Catelyn Tully in a courtyard at Riverrun, laughing at something her brother said, not looking at him. Everything else was the scar tissue. When Lord Hoster Tully arranged Catelyn's betrothal to Brandon Stark, Peter made the most catastrophic decision of his life. He decided to fight for her. Brandon Stark, eldest son of Winterfell, heir to the north, tall, powerful, physically imposing in that easy, negligent way of men who have always been the biggest and strongest and never had to prove it to anyone who mattered. He wore his birthright the way other men wear armor, casually, like something he'd never had to earn, that existed simply as an extension of himself. Peter challenged him to a duel for Catelyn's hand. The hall must have gone quiet in a particular way, not the silence of shock exactly, more the silence of second-hand embarrassment. Everyone in that hall understood what was happening. A boy from the smallest finger of the Vale, 15 years old, was demanding combat with a 20-year-old heir to one of the great houses of Westeros, over a woman who had already been betrothed, over a woman who had not asked to be fought over. Brandon didn't even treat it as a real fight. He beat the boy from the fingers to within an inch of his life, opened a wound across his chest that left a scar Peter carried for the rest of his life. And when he had Peter on the ground and could have ended it, Catelyn begged him to stop, begged him to spare Peter's life. That plea. She didn't beg for him because she loved him. She begged for him because he was a boy she felt responsible for, a harmless, well-meaning little creature who had gotten himself into something he should never have started. She pitied him. Brandon let him live, and that mercy delivered as a favor to someone else, not because Peter had earned it, was more devastating than any killing blow could have been. He had challenged for love and been saved by pity.
Now, here is the moment in this story that most show watchers don't know about, and it reframes everything. In George R.R. Martin's source novels, A Game of Thrones specifically, Peter claims that on the night after the duel, still wounded, still humiliated, Lysa Tully came to his room, and that in the dark, disoriented, perhaps not fully conscious, he took her maidenhood while thinking of her sister, Catelyn. Whether this actually happened exactly as he describes it is one of those deliberately ambiguous details that Martin is extremely good at. Peter Baelish is not a reliable narrator when it comes to his own history, but the psychological weight of the claim, true or strategically exaggerated or outright fabricated, is staggering either way. If it's true, even in his one moment of physical intimacy with another human being, on one of the worst nights of his life, Catelyn was all that existed for him. Lysa was never real to him. She was always a vessel for a feeling he couldn't have. If it's fabricated, he constructed that story specifically to hurt Lysa in a moment when he wanted her to know the full extent of her own irrelevance to him, which is, in its own way, even colder. The outcome is the same. He used Lysa, her feelings, her grief, her years of devotion, the same way he would later use every other human relationship in his life, as a means to an end, as leverage, as a resource to be managed. What happened to Lysa after the duel is its own brutal detail. She became pregnant. Lord Hoster Tully, furious, forced her to drink moon tea, an abortifacient, and the pregnancy was ended. Lysa blamed Peter for this. She also blamed herself. She also, and this is the part that matters for everything that comes later, never stopped loving him. She absorbed this as a tragedy they had shared, and she carried the specific grief of that lost child for decades, and when Peter eventually asked her to poison her husband and frame the Lannisters for it, she said yes, because the man who had treated her as invisible had finally asked her to be useful.
and by then that was the most love she had ever received from him. That is not love. That is favoritism as a weapon.
He was sent away from Riverrun shortly after the duel, disgraced, scarred, dispatched. Lord Hoster's charity had limits, and a wounded boy who had presumed to challenge a great lord's son for his daughter's hand had reached them. And in the long, silent years that followed, years of minor administrative work in the port city of Gulltown, years of living on the extreme periphery of Westerosi power, watching it from the distance, something fundamental restructured itself inside Petyr Baelish. This is the part the show condenses almost entirely. Season 1 gives us Littlefinger as a fully formed operator, charming, dangerous, already in position. We skip the years of assembly, but those years are the whole story. They are the engine that ran everything else. In Gulltown, he was a customs official, a bureaucrat, a man who processed trade documentation and counted ships and registered cargo and stamped documents that powerful men never bothered to read. It sounds like obscurity. It was actually a masterclass. He learned commerce from the ground up. He learned how goods actually moved, where they came from, what they were worth at origin versus what they were worth at destination, how debts were structured and called and weaponized. He learned how information flowed through a port city, what merchants knew that lords didn't, what sailors knew that merchants didn't, what was whispered in harborside taverns while the nobility were congratulating themselves in their keeps. He learned, in other words, the difference between the official version of how the world works and the actual version. His rise in Gulltown was fast enough to attract attention, fast enough that Lord John Arryn, the hand of the king under Robert Baratheon, a man who had actually known and fostered Petyr at Riverrun, who remembered the scrappy, clever boy from the Fingers, brought him to King's Landing. And that is where the real work began. He arrived in King's Landing as the Master of Coin, the position that, in the show, tends to be described as something like Royal Treasurer, the man who manages the Crown's finances, reports on the state of the Treasury, handles trade agreements and taxation. It sounds administrative. It sounds unglamorous. It sounds, frankly, like exactly the kind of job that great lords give to people they don't quite respect but need to be functional. That's precisely what made it perfect. Because here is what Petyr Baelish understood about money that every lord who had ever inherited wealth rather than accumulated it fundamentally failed to grasp. Money is not wealth. Money is power. And the mechanism by which money becomes power is debt. When you inherit gold, you have gold. It buys things. It has limits. When you control debt, when you are the person who decides who can borrow, how much, at what rate, and when repayment is due, you own not just the gold, but the borrower. You own their future behavior. You own their loyalty, or at least their compliance. You own the particular anxiety of a man who is not sure whether his creditor is about to call in what's owed. Littlefinger ran the kingdom's finances at a catastrophic deficit. He borrowed enormous sums from the Iron Bank of Braavos. He borrowed from Westerosi lords. He restructured the debts in ways that were technically legal and practically irreversible. He built an economy in which the Crown's continued functioning depended on his continued management of the relationships with the creditors, which meant that removing him would be not just inconvenient, but destabilizing. He didn't steal the crown's gold, he became the load-bearing wall. But the brothels are the thing people focus on as the obvious sign of Littlefinger's villainy. And yes, there is plenty to say about the ethics of his operation of those establishments, none of which reflects well on him. But the reason the brothels matter strategically has almost nothing to do with the revenue they generated. The brothels were a surveillance apparatus. Every lord, every knight, every minor official, every visiting merchant of importance who passed through those doors left behind fragments of himself. His fears, his shames, his secret loyalties, his outstanding debts, his sexual peculiarities, his true political opinions confessed to a woman he assumed couldn't repeat them. Littlefinger collected these the way others collect gold. He catalogued them. He spent them deliberately. He was at all times the most comprehensively informed man in King's Landing, rivaled only by Varys, who had his own network. And unlike Varys, who used information in service of something he called the realm, Littlefinger used it in service of one thing only: the next move. There is a cold, geometric quality to what Petyr Baelish eventually decided about the world. I want to name it clearly because I think it's the most important thing to understand about him, and the thing that, once you see it, explains every single decision he makes from the moment he leaves Riverrun to the moment he dies. He reached this conclusion: the game, as currently structured, cannot be won by men like me. The rules of Westeros, birth, blood, title, physical strength, inherited obligation, were not written for Petyr Baelish. They would never be written for him. Honor was a currency he didn't have. Lineage was an asset he lacked. The old ways gave no path to power for a boy from the smallest finger of the Vale, the grandson of a foreign mercenary, the man every great house had always regarded as a useful instrument rather than a legitimate player. And the only logical response, Petyr was, above everything else, logical, was to destroy the game and build a new one. Not through revolution, not through armies, through something far more surgical, making himself so indispensable to the existing system that he could hollow it out from within, rewiring it until it ran on his terms, by his rules, toward his ends. He would not try to win the game as it was played. He would be the person who made the game unplayable without him. And then, once he controlled the board, the pieces, the rules, the information, the money, the leverage, he would build something else entirely, something that could not exclude him because he had built it. A world in which the accident of birth didn't determine everything, in which the man with the best intelligence, the best patience, the best understanding of what people wanted could rise to the very top. He called this vision chaos, not destruction for its own sake, chaos as the mechanism by which the old hierarchies, the ones that had humiliated him, that had let him be beaten in a duel and saved by pity and sent away. Chaos isn't a pit, he tells Varys in the small council chamber in Season 3. Chaos is a ladder. The people who cling to the old order, to the realm, to the gods, to love, they fall. The people who understand that the old order is already a fiction, that everything is always already improvised, that stability itself is a kind of manipulation by those who already own the stable ground, those people climb.
Here's what I want you to sit with. He wasn't wrong about the system. He was right. The system of Westeros, stratified by birth, enforced by violence, maintained by the pretense that blood equals virtue, was arbitrary. It was fiction. Ned Stark died because he operated as though the system's stated values were its real values. They weren't. They were never. Peter Baelish saw that more clearly than almost anyone. What broke him wasn't the diagnosis, it was the cure. Because what Peter Baelish chose to do with that accurate analysis of an unjust system was not to build something better, it was to build something worse, a world ordered entirely by leverage, by manipulation, by the weaponization of desire and fear. A world in which nobody could trust anyone, in which every relationship was an instrument, in which love itself was an exploitable vulnerability. He looked at a system that had failed him and concluded not that systems were the problem, that softness was. That the people who had beaten him, Brandon Stark, Lord Hoster Tully, the entire structure of Westerosi nobility, had beaten him not because of the injustice of the system, but because he had been naive enough to feel things and show them and act on them. The duel wasn't Peter Baelish failing to play the game. It was Peter Baelish playing the only honest game he had, and learning from the outcome that honesty was a liability he could not afford.
There is something tragic about this, and I don't think Game of Thrones quite earns its way into that tragedy as cleanly as it should. The show gives us Littlefinger as a finished product, the charming, dangerous, silver-tongued schemer who is always one move ahead. What the books give you in the backstory that Martin has distributed across flashbacks and recollections and carefully calibrated revelations is the process, the actual process by which a person decides to stop feeling. Because that is what Peter Baelish did. Between River Run and King's Landing, between the duel and the brothels, between the boy who begged for love and the man who weaponized it, he decided to stop feeling. Not as a dramatic act of will, as a gradual, practical decision, the same way a soldier stops flinching at certain sounds after long enough. You train yourself, you identify the responses that are getting you hurt, and you work methodically to remove them. He didn't stop loving Catelyn. That's the crucial, heartbreaking detail. He transferred it, he hollowed it out, and refashioned it into something that looked like love from the outside. The fixation on Sansa, whom he saw as Catelyn's daughter and later as Catelyn reborn, while missing everything that actually constituted love. The willingness to prioritize another person's well-being over your own desires. The willingness to give something freely without calculating the return. That was gone. In its place was this extraordinary, terrible instrument, a man who had understood human desire from the inside and had converted that understanding into a weapon, who could perform warmth, perform loyalty, perform concern with enough precision to pass even close scrutiny, because he had once felt those things genuinely and remembered exactly what they looked like. He became, to use a word the show would probably find too on the nose, a mirror. Not a person, a mirror, reflecting back to each person exactly what they needed to see, in exactly the register they needed to receive it, adjusted in real time as circumstances changed.
This is what made him more dangerous than any general, any dragon rider, any monarch in Westeros. A general can be defeated, a dragon can be killed, a king can die, but a mirror, a person who has no fixed commitments, no genuine loyalties, no vulnerable spots of love or honor that can be leveraged against him, that is extremely difficult to stop, because you cannot corner someone who doesn't care about anything. Except Catelyn, and later Sansa. And that is the crack in the foundation of everything he built, the thing he could not fully excise no matter how thoroughly he restructured himself. The love that had caused the duel, that had caused the humiliation, that had caused everything, it didn't disappear. It calcified, it transformed, it became the one place in him where the old vulnerability still lived underneath all the armor. It would eventually be the place that got him killed, not because Arya Stark had a knife, but because Peter Baelish, in his late moves, was still operating, at least in part, from that wound. Still trying, somehow, 40 years later, to win something he had lost in a courtyard at River Run when he was 15 years old.
I want to zoom out for a second, because here's the thing about origin stories. They're only interesting if they explain something, if they give you a lens that makes the rest of the character make sense. The Peter Baelish origin story does that. It explains almost everything. It explains why he chose the specific targets he chose, why he prioritized information over force, why he operated through intermediaries, through Lysa, through the Gold Cloaks, through hired assassins, almost always keeping his own hands clean. Because a boy who learned in a duel at 15 that physical force was a language he would never speak fluently, concluded that other languages needed to become his native tongue. He found his fluencies, and he became extraordinary at them. It explains why he could not stop, why accumulating power wasn't a goal he could reach and set down, because it was never really about the Iron Throne, or the Vale, or even the North. It was about the feeling of being the one who couldn't be removed, the one who couldn't be dismissed, the one who couldn't be betrothed away from, beaten in a courtyard, sent away in disgrace. The accumulation of power was the ongoing proof that the world could not afford to treat him as irrelevant. The moment he stopped climbing, the proof expired. And it explains, most importantly, the particular shape of his relationship with every person he ever manipulated. He didn't hate the people he used. He studied them with something close to genuine fascination. He understood them, in many cases, better than they understood themselves. The betrayal of Ned Stark was not casual cruelty. It was the action of a man who had looked at Ned, found him genuinely admirable in the abstract, and concluded that admirable people were the easiest to destroy because they operated from fixed positions. Honor is predictable. Predictable is exploitable. That is the boy from the Fingers. That is what River Run made. That is what Brandon Stark's sword, dragged across a 15-year-old's chest, assembled over the course of the long, quiet years that followed. And in Season 1, before a single major death had occurred, before the war that would kill hundreds of thousands had begun, Peter Baelish was already in position, already had been in position for years. The machine was already running. The only thing left to do was light the match. After spending way too many hours with this character, rewatching scenes, reading the books, reading Martin's interviews, reading the academic papers people have written about medieval financial history and Richelieu and Byzantine court politics, just to understand the depth of what Martin was building, here is what I keep coming back to. Peter Baelish is a tragedy. Not a villain, a tragedy. The distinction matters. Villains are useful for their menace. Tragedies are useful for their mirror. And Peter Baelish, properly understood, is a mirror held up to every stratified system that produces the conditions that produces him. Every society that tells certain people, because of birth, because of class, because of the arbitrary accidents of origin, that they will never fully belong, that the game is not designed for them, that they can be useful but never legitimate. Most of the people those systems exclude find ways to live within the damage. They adjust, they accommodate, they find smaller satisfactions and call them enough. And a very small number, the ones with a specific combination of intelligence and grievance and patience, in whom the capacity for love has been precisely and brutally thwarted at the exact wrong moment, they become something else. Peter Baelish was not born dangerous. He was made dangerous by a system that had no place for him, by a love he was not allowed to have, by a duel he could not win, and by a mercy that was worse than the wound. The boy from the fingers wanted to belong to the world. The world said no, and the world paid for that. Here is the most important sentence in all of Game of Thrones. Not Dracarys, not the North remembers, not anything Tyrion said in a trial or anything Cersei whispered in a throne room. It happens in Season 4, Episode 7, Mockingbird, and it is delivered almost as an aside, halfway through a scene, to a woman who is about to die. Lysa Arryn is holding Sansa over the moon door. She's screaming about betrayal, about years of sacrifice, about everything she gave up for the man she loved. And Peter Baelish walks toward her, calm as still water, and talks her down. The immediate crisis passes. Lysa starts to soften. And then, in the same fluid motion, he opens the door and pushes her through it. But it's not the push that matters. It's what he says in the second before. I have only ever loved one woman, only one my entire life, your sister. Read that again. In the moment before he murders the woman who had loved him since childhood, the woman who had done literally everything he asked, including kill her own husband, he tells her the truth. Not to be cruel, not even primarily to hurt her. He tells her because it's the most efficient way to control the situation before the fall. He deploys truth like a blade at the precise moment maximum damage can be extracted from it. That is Peter Baelish in a single scene. And if you missed the full enormity of what that scene was telling you, don't worry. Most people did. That's the whole point. To understand the scale of what Peter Baelish did, you have to understand the particular stability, the particular brittleness of the political situation at the start of the series. Robert Baratheon has been king for 17 years. He won the throne through war, not birthright, through the famous rebellion that toppled the Mad King, Aerys Targaryen. Robert is beloved, but he is also lazy, distracted, drowning in wine and hunting trips, and the general ennui of a warrior who no longer has a war. The administrative machinery of the realm, the actual governance, the law, the money, runs on three people: the hand of the king, the master of coin, and the small council. The hand of the king is John Arryn. He was Robert's foster father. He helped start the rebellion. He is trustworthy, experienced, and has been the practical backbone of the realm for the entirety of Robert's reign. He is 60-something years old and in excellent health. The master of coin, the man who controls all the crown's finances, is Petyr Baelish. Now, here is what Petyr Baelish knows that nobody else in Westeros knows. Queen Cersei's 3 children, Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, are not Robert's children. They are the product of incestuous relationship with her twin brother, Jaime Lannister. This is treason. High treason, actually. It means the heir to the Iron Throne is a bastard with no legitimate claim, which means the moment this information becomes public, the political situation destabilizes with extreme prejudice. John Arryn also knows this. He figured it out through his own investigation, noticing that all of Robert's acknowledged bastards had the same dark Baratheon features, while Cersei's golden children shared no resemblance to the king. He was preparing to tell Robert. Had he done so, the fallout would have been severe, but it would have been controlled. A political crisis, certainly, possibly a war with the Lannisters, but Westeros was capable of surviving that. The institutions were intact. John Arryn was alive. Robert had capable advisors and a loyal northern ally in Eddard Stark. Littlefinger could not allow that containment.
Here's where it gets genuinely cold. Lysa Tully, Jon Arryn's wife, sister to Catelyn, a woman who had been in love with Petyr Baelish since they were children together at River Run, had long since crossed any line that separated devotion from obsession. Petyr Littlefinger had maintained just enough contact with her over the years to keep that obsession functional. Just enough warmth, just enough intimacy, just enough to ensure that when the moment came, she would do what he asked. He asked her to murder her husband. Not with a sword, not with anything traceable. He supplied her with a poison called tears of lice, colorless, odorless, untraceable, which produces symptoms that mimic a gradual wasting illness. Jon Arryn died slowly, over days, of what appeared to be natural causes. A man in his 60s, dying of apparent illness, nobody considered murder. His maester noted the decline. His physicians did what physicians in medieval settings do. They watched him deteriorate and offered ineffective remedies. And Lysa watched her husband die and said nothing because Petyr had asked her to, and she loved Petyr, and she always would. Here is the thing that broke my brain about this when I first really sat with it. Littlefinger did not hold the weapon, he held the person who held it. The most dangerous man in Westeros never got his hands dirty. Not once, not in 17 years of scheming. He understood something that actual violence merchants like Cersei and Tywin never did. That proximity to the act is liability. If you're the one who poisoned someone, you can be traced. But if you locate a person whose desire to please you is strong enough that they will do it for you and do it gladly, there is no trace that leads back to you. Lysa's guilt is Lysa's guilt. Petyr was elsewhere. Jon Arryn is dead. The position of Hand of the King is vacant. Robert Baratheon is left without his most trusted advisor. The political center of the realm has quietly been hollowed out. But the poison alone wasn't enough.
A murder creates a vacancy. Littlefinger needed chaos. Those are different things. For chaos, you need a narrative, a villain, a direction for grief and anger to travel. So he had Lysa write a letter. The letter was addressed to her sister, Catelyn Stark, in Winterfell. Its message was simple and devastating. The Lannisters had murdered Jon Arryn. This was a lie, completely fabricated. The Lannisters had nothing to do with Jon Arryn's death. They didn't even know Lysa had done it. But the letter pointed Catelyn's grief, her fear, and her fury directly at House Lannister. And when Catelyn brought this letter to Ned Stark, her husband, the Lord of Winterfell, a man whose honor was so absolute it was essentially a disability in Westerosi politics, the machinery started turning. Ned arrived in King's Landing, and Peter Baelish was there to greet him. Think about that for a second. The man who engineered everything that caused Ned to come south, who created the false accusation that Ned was now riding toward King's Landing to investigate, was the man standing in the courtyard to welcome him, smiling, offering to help. That broke my brain completely.
Before Ned even arrived in King's Landing, Littlefinger had already been working a separate angle. When Bran Stark fell from that tower in Winterfell, pushed by Jaime Lannister, though nobody knew that yet, and lay in a coma, someone sent a hired assassin to finish the job. The assassin carried a Valyrian steel dagger. Catelyn Stark caught the man and killed him in her son's room. She kept the dagger. When she later traveled to King's Landing to investigate and show Ned the dagger, she went to Littlefinger, an old friend, someone she trusted, a man who grew up at Riverrun alongside her. Littlefinger told her the dagger had belonged to him. He said he'd lost it in a bet to Tyrion Lannister. This was almost certainly a fabrication. There is no evidence anywhere in the narrative that Tyrion owned that dagger, but the claim was devastating in its precision. It took an already frightened mother, gave her a specific Lannister to focus her fear on, and sent her spiraling toward exactly the kind of reckless action that grief produces. Catelyn arrested Tyrion Lannister on the road, publicly, in front of witnesses. You want to understand what that single act cost? It cost the realm whatever slim remaining chance existed for de-escalation. Tywin Lannister's son, publicly seized on the basis of a story Littlefinger told, was now in Stark custody. The Lannister patriarch, a man whose entire identity was built around the principle that debts get paid and insults get repaid, began mobilizing Lannister armies in the Riverlands. One fabricated sentence delivered in a private room, and the realm moved 3 degrees closer to war. Here is where Littlefinger's genius becomes almost obscene in its confidence. Ned Stark arrives in King's Landing and immediately begins investigating Jon Arryn's death, the death that Littlefinger himself arranged. And Littlefinger volunteers to help. Not passive help, active help. He escorts Ned through the city. He introduces him to people. He provides information. He's available, useful, apparently candid about the dangers of the court. He even warns Ned, famously, not to trust him. "I did warn you not to trust me," he says later. He flagged himself as untrustworthy while simultaneously positioning himself as Ned's most reliable guide through King's Landing. Here's what I want you to sit with. That warning was the most effective misdirection in the entire series. By naming himself as someone not to be trusted, Littlefinger invited Ned and the audience to feel like we were seeing through him, like we knew he was up to something, so we were on guard. It made the warning itself feel like a kind of honesty, the implication being a truly dangerous schemer wouldn't tell you he was dangerous, so the fact that he was saying it meant maybe he was, at some level, being straight with you. He wasn't. He never was. Every person Littlefinger introduced Ned to, he introduced in a specific order, for a specific reason. A seamstress named Mira, who had slept with a man named Hugh of the Vale, who had been John Arryn's squire. A master of ships who knew about Arryn's final investigation, specifically into King Robert's bastards. Each piece of information Ned uncovered felt like a discovery. It was not. It was a guided tour. Ned thought he was detecting. Pater was the investigation, running from inside, pointing a good man toward the conclusions that would ignite a war. That is not manipulation. That is architecture.
And then we arrive at the moment everyone remembers. Ned Stark has done it. He's followed the trail. He's figured out that Cersei's children are not Robert's. He has proof, or at least enough to act. He knows what the law requires. He knows what his honor demands. He will go to Robert. But Robert is gone, hunting, and before he can return, there's a window, a dangerous, narrow window where Cersei might act first. Ned goes to Littlefinger. He tells him the plan. Arrest Cersei. Present the evidence to Robert. Let justice work. He needs the gold cloaks, the city watch, to support him. Littlefinger controls the gold cloaks. "The gold cloaks are yours," Littlefinger tells him. He was lying. Ned moves. He goes to the throne room to announce his evidence and demand Cersei's arrest, and the gold cloaks, Littlefinger's gold cloaks, stand with the Lannisters. "I did warn you not to trust me," Baelish says, holding a knife to Ned's throat. Ned Stark is arrested. Within days he is taken to the great sept of Baelor, meant to be exiled, and at Joffrey's impulsive order, an order that surprised even the Lannisters, he is executed in front of thousands. His oldest son, Robb, raises the northern bannermen in response and marches south. Renly Baratheon claims the throne. Stannis Baratheon claims the throne. The Iron Islands revolt. Robb Stark declares the North independent. 5 kings, open war, hundreds of thousands dead, entire houses extinguished. Dragons eventually return to the world. The chain of causation runs, unbroken, back to Lysa Tully's cup of tears of Lys and a letter she wrote at Peter's request. Every burning village, every widow's cry, every child who grew up knowing only war because of the decade-long conflict that followed, the bodies that piled so high the crow populations of the Riverlands grew fat on them. All of it traces back to one small man who decided, after a duel he never should have fought, that if the world would not give him a place at the table, he would burn the table down.
Here's where most analyses of Littlefinger stop. They catalog what he did,
They marvel at the architecture. They call him a genius because he was, and they move on. But I want to push on the why, because the why is what turns a catalog of clever scheming into something that actually matters. The standard answer is ambition. Littlefinger wanted power, wealth, the throne itself. Chaos is a ladder, he tells Varys in a Season 3 scene we'll get to in a later chapter. He saw the stable political order as an obstacle, and he wanted it gone. That's true, but it's incomplete, because there's a more specific thing he wanted underneath the ambition that explains why the war needed to start this way, with these specific weapons aimed at these specific people. Ned Stark was Catelyn's husband. House Stark was Catelyn's family. Jon Arryn was the man who had put the Tully daughters in reach of powerful marriages that had kept Catelyn forever in a world Pater couldn't access, bound to people who had more claim on her loyalty than he ever did. The institutions of Westeros, the marriage alliances, the dynastic hierarchies, the honor systems that made a man like Ned Stark trustworthy and a man like Pater Baelish permanently suspect. These were not just obstacles to power. They were the specific architects that had decided years ago that Catelyn Tully would marry Brandon Stark and not the boy from the Fingers. Littlefinger didn't just want to climb the ladder, he wanted to knock down the structure that had built the ladder without him. The war wasn't just a power grab, it was obliteration of the world that had humiliated him. Ned Stark's execution wasn't just a tactical move to destabilize the North, it was the elimination of the man who had Catelyn. The fracture of the realm wasn't just chaos to exploit, it was the destruction of a system whose entire architecture was built on exactly the kinds of inherited advantage that had always excluded him. He burned the world because it had never made room for him, and he found a way to do it with perfect deniability, using other people's hands so that when the fire started, nobody looked at the man holding the match.
Now, I want to give you something that most show-only viewers never got because the show didn't have the space for it, and because what the books reveal about Littlefinger's operational infrastructure makes everything I've described feel even more calculated. In George R.R. Martin's source novels, Littlefinger doesn't arrive in King's Landing as an already confident schemer. He arrives after years spent as a customs official in the port city of Gulltown, one of the Vale's major trading hubs. This is not a glamorous position. It is the bureaucratic equivalent of working in a toll booth. But what Gulltown gave him was something he could not have gotten in any noble hall: mastery of the mechanics of commerce, debt, and financial leverage. He watched ships come in, he tracked cargo, he understood how money actually moved, not the noble fantasy of gold changing hands in throne rooms, but the actual plumbing of Westerosi economics, the trade routes, the tariff structures, the credit networks, the way certain merchant houses were dependent on certain lords, the way certain lords were secretly dependent on certain lenders. He built relationships quietly, patiently, with people that lords considered beneath notice. By the time he arrived in King's Landing, he understood the realm's financial architecture more deeply than anyone who had been born inside it. And because he was small, unimpressive, and from nowhere, nobody thought to guard against him.
Here's the thing about his brothels that the show treated as a kind of scandalous background detail. They weren't primarily a business. They were a surveillance apparatus. Lords, knights, merchants, officials, everyone eventually ended up in those rooms. And everyone in rooms like that said things they didn't mean to say, admitted fears, revealed loyalties, disclosed debts, named enemies. And every word, every indiscretion, every whispered secret flowed back to Littlefinger, catalogued and stored against future use. He was the most comprehensively informed man in the capital, not because he was particularly brilliant at intelligence work, but because he had, years before, designed every mechanism by which that information would flow to him. He didn't gather intelligence, he built plumbing, and the entire court used that plumbing without ever knowing it existed. By the time he became master of coin and started running the crown's finances, he was already sitting on a mountain of debt, leverage, and knowledge. He didn't need to steal power. He just needed to wait for the moment when the system he had already hollowed out would require someone to push it. Jon Arryn's death was that push.
Here's what I want you to sit with, because I think it's the most important thing to understand about how Littlefinger actually functioned, and why he's so much more interesting than any of the show's more visible villains. Cersei is visible. Her scheming is personal, emotional, telegraphed by her contempt and her fear. You can see her moving. You can see her calculating. She leaves fingerprints. Tywin is visible in a different way, not emotional, but architectural. You understand that he is always thinking several moves ahead, but his moves are large: armies, marriage alliances, public gestures of dominance, things that announce themselves. Littlefinger is invisible, not because he hides. He doesn't particularly. He's at court, in the council room, accessible, chatty, visible as a person, but his machinery is invisible. The actual workings of his schemes are embedded so thoroughly in the background of every scene that they're not perceptible as schemes at all. They look like weather, like coincidence, like the natural unfolding of events that everyone had always predicted. John Arlen died of illness. How sad. Lysa sent a letter to her sister. Well, she was grieving and frightened. Who could blame her? Catelyn arrested Tyrion on the road. Impulsive, perhaps, but she'd been told it was his dagger. Ned trusted the gold cloaks, reasonable, since the master of the coin had assured him they were loyal. Each individual decision by each individual person was entirely explicable without reference to Peter Baelish. None of it looked like a conspiracy. It looked like a series of understandable human reactions to events as they occurred. That's not luck. That's precision engineering. The difference between a schemer and an architect is that a schemer maneuvers in the present. They react, they improvise, they capitalize. An architect builds structures that function without their presence. Littlefinger set up a system where the desired outcome, war, chaos, the elimination of the existing order, would be produced by other people's autonomous decisions, each person acting entirely out of their own psychology, none of them ever needing to know they were part of a plan. He didn't have to be in Winterfell for Catelyn to panic.
He didn't have to be in the Riverlands for her to arrest Tyrion. He didn't have to whisper in Robb Stark's ear for Robb to march south in fury and grief after his father's execution. He built a machine, loaded it, and then walked away. The machine ran itself.
Let me be specific about what was sacrificed for this scheme, because I think the scale of it tends to get lost in the dramatic momentum of the show itself. Jon Arryn was a good man, whatever that phrase means in the specific moral universe of Westeros, where good men are rare and goodness is frequently inadequate. Jon Arryn was one of them. He had fostered both Robert and Ned. He had helped prevent the Mad King's worst impulses from destroying the realm during Aerys's reign. He held the kingdom together with quiet, competent, unglamorous governance for 17 years. He died slowly, frightened and confused in his bed, murdered by the wife who was supposed to love him. Lysa was a casualty too, a psychological one, long before Littlefinger eventually pushed her through the moon door. She had been devoted to him since childhood, and that devotion had been carefully kept warm enough to remain useful, never allowed to develop into anything that might create obligation. She didn't murder her husband because she was evil. She murdered her husband because a man she loved asked her to, and after a lifetime of being given just enough to keep hoping, she would have done anything he asked. She had no idea what she was being used for. The tragedy of Lysa Arryn is not that she was a villain. She was barely a villain. She was a mark. And then there are the hundreds of thousands of people who died in the war Littlefinger sparked. Soldiers on both sides of the Battle of the Blackwater, the entire Stark host, the men who died at the Red Wedding, the small folk of the Riverlands whose villages were burned and reburned by passing armies for years. These are not abstractions. These are the price in blood of one man's decision to burn a world that had excluded him. I am not saying Littlefinger was wrong to resent the system. The system was unjust. It was built on inherited advantage and the casual cruelty of those born into power. His grievance was real. His intelligence was real. His exclusion was real. But here's what I want you to sit with. The fact that the grievance was real doesn't make the response proportionate. Peter Baelish was genuinely wronged by a system that had no place for him, and he responded by arranging for hundreds of thousands of people who had nothing to do with that wrong to die in a war they didn't understand and couldn't stop. The boy from the Fingers had real reasons to be angry. The method he chose to express that anger cost more innocent lives than any dragon in the series.
I want to end this chapter by looking at the full shape of what Littlefinger built, because when you pull back far enough to see the whole architecture, it is genuinely staggering. A man with no army, no house of note, no birthright claim to anything. A man who by every metric the world around him used to measure importance was essentially irrelevant, managed to assassinate the most powerful non-royal official in the realm, using a woman whose devotion he had cultivated over decades, leaving no trace of his own involvement.
fabricate an accusation so precisely calibrated to the psychology of its intended recipient, a grieving, frightened sister who loved and trusted Catelyn, that it produced exactly the response he needed without requiring a single moment of direct pressure. Redirect an already destabilizing investigation by a powerful lord toward a predetermined conclusion, guiding from inside the investigation itself, never appearing to steer. Manufacture a Lannister-Stark flashpoint using a single lie about a dagger, a lie told in a private room to a grieving mother that produced a public arrest with the force of a torch thrown into a powder store. And finally, at the last moment, execute a direct betrayal so clean, so efficiently timed, that the man being betrayed literally did not realize it was happening until a blade was at his throat. 5 steps, across years, involving dozens of people, none of whom ever had the full picture. Each step is plausible as coincidence. Each step produces the next with mechanical precision. That is not clever scheming. That is the work of a mind operating at a category above everyone around it. And the most unsettling part? For Littlefinger, this was not the end. This was the beginning. The war wasn't his goal. The war was the context, the fertile chaos in which everything he actually wanted could be grown without anyone having the bandwidth to notice. His real plan was still years away. And we'll get to that. There is a specific kind of loneliness in being the most capable person in the room. I don't say that to sentimentalize, but dear Baelish, I am not interested in sentimentalizing a man who arranged a war that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The bodies in the Riverlands are real even in fiction, and nothing I've said should be read as an argument that his intelligence excuses what he used it for. But I think about the specific texture of what it must have been like to watch Ned Stark arrive in King's Landing, to escort him through the streets, to answer his questions, to introduce him to exactly the right people in exactly the right order, while knowing precisely what was coming. The execution that Ned's honor made inevitable. The war that Ned's trust had already made unstoppable. And underneath it, the particular cold knowledge that Ned had what Petyr had always wanted, had always had it by sheer accident of birth, and had no idea it was about to cost him everything. There is something in Littlefinger's expression when he watches Ned Stark move through King's Landing. If you go back and watch, and I mean really watch, the small moments, the reactions before the line reads, you'll see it. It's not a triumph. It's not contempt. It's something closer to an architect watching a building he spent years designing being demolished and finding the destruction beautiful precisely because he made it. That is not a healthy emotion, but it is a human one. And that's not a villain, that's a tragedy wearing a villain's face. Here's what I want you to carry into the next chapter. We've seen Littlefinger's scheme. We've walked through every domino, every calculated lie, every carefully placed piece of leverage. We understand the architecture. The next chapter is about the how. Not the steps, but the psychology, the specific weapons he used, how information becomes power in his hands in a way it doesn't in anyone else's, how he understood desire as a mechanism with predictable tolerances, how he thought about patience in a way that no one around him was equipped to counter.
Because knowing what he did is one thing. Understanding how he thought, that changes how you see every scene he's in, from the very first moment he appears on screen. We haven't even started yet.
Before we get into Littlefinger specifically, we need to understand the intellectual environment he was operating in, because his genius looks different and honestly more impressive when you understand just how limited the thinking of his contemporaries actually was. Ned Stark thought in terms of honor. This is not a naive observation, it's a precise one. Honor for Ned was not a sentiment, it was a complete decision-making framework. When faced with any choice, the question Ned asked, consciously or not, was, what does honor require here? This framework had the enormous advantage of making him predictable in the best sense, trustworthy, consistent, someone men would follow into fire. It had the catastrophic disadvantage of making him legible. Anyone who understood that Ned operated from a single fixed principle could model exactly what he would do in any given situation and design situations accordingly. Littlefinger understood this in about 30 seconds of knowing Ned Stark, probably less. Tywin Lannister thought in terms of legacy. Every decision Tywin made ran through the filter of what it would mean for House Lannister in 20 years, in 100 years. He was smarter than most, and he was genuinely formidable. But legacy thinking has its own blind spots. It tends toward caution, toward preservation, toward protecting what already exists. Tywin was brilliant at defending and extending an established position. He was less equipped for the kind of radical improvisation that chaos demands, because radical improvisation is bad for legacy. It's messy. It creates precedents you didn't intend. Varys thought in terms of the realm, and here's the thing, Varys was probably the only person in Westeros whose intellectual framework was large enough to see Littlefinger coming. He knew, he watched, he understood at some level what Pater was building. But his framework, the abstract good of the realm, the preservation of stability for the small folk, made him constitutionally unable to do what Littlefinger was doing. You cannot use the realm's welfare as a weapon. It's not a weapon. It's a constraint. Littlefinger thought in terms of leverage. Not power exactly, not wealth exactly. Leverage, the specific relationship between what someone wants and your position relative to their ability to get it. Every person he encountered was immediately assessed. What do they want most? What do they fear most? What would they sacrifice to get the former or avoid the latter? And critically, how can I position myself so that I am the variable between them and either outcome? He didn't ask, what do I want when he entered a room? He asked, what does this room want, and how do I become the answer? That reorientation from subject to instrument, from desire to leverage, is the core of everything. Let's be specific about what information as a weapon meant in Littlefinger's hands, because it's easy to gloss over this as though it's obvious. It isn't. Everyone in the Game of Thrones collected information. Varys had his little birds, a network of child spies threaded through the capital and beyond. The Lannisters had their own spies, their own channels. Every great house had informants. Information was understood to be valuable. Nobody was naive about this. But Littlefinger's approach to information was architecturally different from everyone else's in two specific ways. First, he collected it passively, through infrastructure he'd built rather than agents he'd dispatched. The brothels were not primarily a business, they were a collection mechanism. Lords, knights, merchants, officials, minor functionaries with access to powerful people, they all came through those rooms eventually. And everyone in that specific context talked. People confess things in intimacy that they'd never say in daylight. They name enemies, they admit fears, they describe debts, they brag about secrets. And every fragment that passed through those rooms passed through the women and men Littlefinger employed back to him. He wasn't running agents, he was running plumbing. The information flowed to him the way water flows downhill, through channels he'd dug, in directions he'd designed, without requiring his active intervention at every step. That is categorically different from what Varys was doing, and it's more scalable. Varys's little birds required management. Littlefinger's infrastructure ran itself. Second, and this is the part that usually gets missed, Littlefinger understood that information is most valuable not when you use it, but when you withhold it strategically. The obvious use of damaging information is blackmail. You know something, you threaten exposure, you extract what you need. That works, but it's a one-time weapon. The moment you use it, the target knows you have it. They start guarding against you. You've spent a resource and revealed your hand simultaneously. Littlefinger rarely used information directly. What he did instead was use information to steer. He knew what someone wanted and feared, so he arranged circumstances, introduced specific people, ensured specific things were said in specific rooms, in ways that guided targets toward decisions that served him, without ever revealing that guidance was happening. The target thought they were responding to events. They were responding to a stage set Littlefinger had built around them. There's a scene in Season 1, the scene where Littlefinger escorts Ned through King's Landing to investigate Jon Arryn's death, where this is happening in real time, in full view, and still most viewers don't see it. Ned is being guided. Every introduction Littlefinger makes, every door he opens, every piece of information he provides, it's a route toward a conclusion that Peter has already decided Ned should reach. Ned's investigation feels like discovery. It is curated. Littlefinger is not helping Ned find the truth. He's selecting which truths Ned finds, in what order, to produce a specific emotional and political state in a man he is about to destroy. That's not intelligence work. That's direction. He is directing Ned Stark the way a director blocks a scene, controlling sightlines, controlling information, controlling the emotional journey, producing a performance that serves the story Littlefinger has written.
This one is underrated in most analyses, and I want to spend real time on it because the financial architecture Littlefinger built was arguably more dangerous than his political scheming, and it outlasted him. When Peter Baelish became master of coin, the crown's finances were already under strain. Wars are expensive. Robert's court was extravagant. The Lannister gold that had funded the early years of the reign was finite. There was a gap between what the crown spent and what it collected, and that gap needed to be bridged with debt. Littlefinger didn't invent crown debt, he weaponized it. As master of coin, he had discretion over where the crown borrowed and on what terms. He borrowed heavily, catastrophically by the end, from the Iron Bank of Braavos, an institution that the series makes clear is not sentimental about repayment. He also borrowed from Westerosi lords, and here is where the genius and the malevolence of the scheme becomes clear. When the crown borrows from a lord, that lord has a financial interest in the crown's stability. His money is tied up in the throne's continued functioning. He becomes, quietly, a stakeholder in the existing order. But Littlefinger was the man who arranged the loans, which meant the lords who had lent money to the crown knew that Littlefinger was the one who had connected them to this opportunity. He was their point of contact. Their relationship wasn't purely with the institution, it was, at least partially, personal. And personal relationships create personal obligations. More importantly, Littlefinger controlled the terms. He knew who owed what, to whom, on what schedule. In a world where information about someone's debts is equivalent to information about their vulnerabilities, knowing the complete financial picture of every lord who had dealings with the crown meant knowing their pressure points. He didn't need to threaten anyone. He just needed them to understand, on some level, that he was the man who understood the numbers, and that being on good terms with the man who understood the numbers was a reasonable precaution. He didn't steal the crown's gold. That would have been a crime, discoverable, punishable. What he did was more elegant and more permanent. He made the entire system structurally dependent on his continued involvement. He was the load-bearing wall. Remove him and the ceiling falls, which meant no one with any sense would remove him, even people who suspected what he was doing, even people who actively distrusted him, because the alternative was financial collapse. He wasn't indispensable because he was powerful. He was indispensable because he had built a system that couldn't function without him. Those are different things. Power can be taken. Indispensability has to be dismantled from the inside, carefully, over time. Nobody ever got the time.
This is the one that made Littlefinger genuinely dangerous in a way that neither information nor money alone could achieve, because information can be guarded against. Be careful what you say in certain rooms. Be careful who you trust. Money can be refused. Not everyone has debts. Not everyone can be bought. But desire is not optional. You cannot opt out of wanting things. You cannot wall yourself off from needing things. And in a world of people who wanted and needed and feared and hoped, Peter Baelish moved like a man who had memorized the complete map of human wanting and built his career on selling people the illusion that their desires were being served. The mechanism was consistent, regardless of target. Step 1, identify what this person wants most, not what they say they want, not what they want to perform, what they actually want, the thing underneath the thing, the desire that shapes decisions without being named. Lysa wanted to be loved, specifically to be chosen, not just accepted, chosen, preferred. That hunger was with her since childhood, and it never went away. Ned Stark wanted the realm to be safe and just, wanted to live in a world where honor was sufficient, where good men were protected. Cersei wanted her children secured on the throne and her enemies unable to touch them. Each of these wants was real, specific, and powerful. Step 2, arrange yourself between them and that wanting, not as an obstacle, as a solution. The person should feel clearly and genuinely that you and you alone have the capacity or the will or the access to give them what they need. Lysa spent decades believing Peter was the only man who truly understood her. Ned believed Peter was the only man in King's Landing willing to help him navigate the court honestly. Cersei, at various moments, believed Peter was pragmatically on her side in ways that others weren't. Step 3, collect the obligation. Not immediately. Patience is the whole game. You allow people to enjoy the benefit of your assistance for long enough that they forget to ask what it costs. They begin to feel safe. They begin to trust. They begin to structure their plans around your involvement. And by the time you need something from them, by the time the obligation comes due, the relationship is so established, the dependence so embedded that they have no good options except to pay. What made this so effective is the part I want to dwell on. He was often actually helping them in the short term with the specific thing they asked for. Lysa got attention and letters and eventual marriage. Ned got real information about John Arryn's death, partial information, selectively true but real. Cersei got support at moments she needed it. This is why his victims rarely saw it coming, because the relationship had produced genuine benefit. The trap doesn't feel like a trap when the bait is real food.
There is a line in Season 1, Episode 3, Lord Snow, that most viewers read as Littlefinger being candid, or at least ironically self-aware. Ned has just expressed distrust. Littlefinger responds, "Distrusting me was the wisest thing you've done since climbing off your horse." This is not candor. This is his most sophisticated weapon in action. By naming himself as untrustworthy, Littlefinger did several things simultaneously. He made Ned feel smart for perceiving the obvious. He made Ned feel like he was already one step ahead, already guarding against the manipulation, already seeing through it. And crucially, that sense of having seen through the trick made Ned stop looking for the real one, because the real one isn't performing untrustworthy behavior. The real one is the infrastructure of the scheme already in motion, the letter already sent, the gold cloaks already instructed, the scenario already being built around Ned without his awareness. The most effective misdirection makes the target feel like a good detective. You show them something that looks like the trick, let them catch it, let them feel clever, and while they're feeling clever, the real move happens elsewhere. Magicians call it the flash. Littlefinger built his entire persona on it. He gave people the illusion of perceiving his game so they would stop looking for the real one. Read that again.
I said 3 weapons, and now I'm giving you 4. The 4th is what makes the other 3 work, which is why it deserves its own space. Littlefinger did not think in seasons. He didn't even think in years exactly. He thought in conditions. He would identify a desired endgame, identify the conditions that would need to be in place for that endgame to be achievable, and then work backward to understand what had to be built or destroyed or positioned in order for those conditions to eventually exist. Then he'd start building and wait. Littlefinger Lysa was cultivated over decades. He maintained just enough contact, just enough warmth to keep her devotion functional, without ever giving enough to satisfy it. A satisfied Lysa would have moved on. An unsatisfied but hopeful Lysa remained available. He managed her longing the way a farmer manages water, just enough to keep the crop alive, carefully preventing both drought and flood. The Gulltown years, those years in the port city, running customs, accumulating financial knowledge and low-level contacts, were not a detour. They were preparing. He was building the intellectual infrastructure that would make him indispensable in King's Landing before he ever arrived there. Most people who want power want it now. They look for the fastest route, the most direct path. Littlefinger looked for the most durable route, even if it took 20 years. His opponents, Ned, Tywin, Cersei, were all in different ways reacting to the present, managing the current crisis, responding to what was happening. Littlefinger was almost always managing a future that hadn't arrived yet. He was playing the board that would exist in 5 moves, while everyone else was playing the current board. This is not a minor advantage. This is the difference between someone who learns to read and everyone else in a world without books. And here's the implication that matters most. His patience meant his plans were resilient. A scheme built on immediate opportunity fails when the opportunity shifts. A scheme built on structural conditions, on slowly built dependencies, on carefully maintained relationships, on financial architectures that take years to construct, doesn't evaporate when circumstances change. It adapts. It has depth. It has multiple redundancies. Tywin Lannister's greatest schemes had a brittleness to them. They required specific people to behave in specific ways at specific moments. When Joffrey went off script at the Sept, Tywin's careful political theater collapsed. When Tyrion shot a crossbow bolt through him, decades of careful legacy building died with him. Littlefinger's schemes, by contrast, were self-reinforcing. Each step created conditions that made the next step more achievable. The assassination of Jon Arryn created the war. The war created chaos. The chaos created vacuums. The vacuums created opportunities for a man who'd spent 20 years positioning himself to exploit exactly this kind of disorder. Each layer strengthened the one above it. That's not clever, that's architectural. And in a world full of smart people thinking about the next move, he was the only one thinking about the building.
Season 3, Episode 6, The Climb. Littlefinger stands watching Ross, a young woman who worked in his establishments, who had been passing information to Varys, being shot full of crossbow bolts by Joffrey, who uses her body as target practice. While this is happening, Littlefinger speaks. In voiceover, or rather in a kind of deliberate theatrical address that the show frames as simultaneous with the scene, he delivers the following. Chaos isn't a pit. Chaos is a ladder. Many who try to climb it fail and never get to try again. The fall breaks them. And some are given a chance to climb, but refuse. They cling to the realm, or the gods, or love, illusions. Only the ladder is real. The climb is all there is. The staging matters. He is watching a woman die, a woman whose death he arranged by passing her to Varys as a double agent, knowing that Varys would be caught, knowing that the discovery would cost Ross her life, and he is philosophizing, not as a defense mechanism, not as dissociation. He is narrating. He is telling you, with full awareness of what is happening in front of him, what he believes. That is a person without the usual friction between thought and consequence. Most people, watching someone die, don't speak in complete philosophical sentences. The horror interrupts the language. Not Littlefinger. For him, the event and the philosophy are the same thing. The death is an illustration of the argument. Let me walk you through what the argument actually is. This seems obvious until you think about what the opposite claim implies. The conventional wisdom shared by Ned Stark, by Tywin Lannister, by Robert Baratheon, by essentially every person in the ruling class of Westeros, is that chaos is fundamentally dangerous, fundamentally downward.
It is something to be prevented, contained, survived. You fall into chaos. You get trapped in it. The pit metaphor captures the intuition. A pit is a place you don't want to be, and the goal is to stay out of it or climb back out if you fall in. This view makes complete sense if you are someone who benefits from the current order. Ned Stark has no interest in chaos. He has a dynasty to protect. Ned Stark has no interest in chaos. He has a family, a domain, a set of institutions that function as the architecture of everything he cares about. For these men, chaos is genuinely a pit. It threatens the structures that make their lives valuable and possible. But notice, this view requires that you have something to protect, something that the current order shelters, something that stability maintains. Petyr Baelish had none of that. He had no dynasty, no ancestral seat worth defending, no network of honor-based relationships that functioned within the existing system. Everything he had built, his wealth, his access, his influence, he had built himself, in the gaps and margins of a system that had never been designed to accommodate him. He owed nothing to the existing order. The existing order owed him nothing. For a man in that position, chaos is not a pit. It is a neutralizer. It is the great eraser that wipes out the advantages of those who benefit from stability and creates, in the resulting vacuum, opportunities for the most adaptable to fill. He's not being metaphorical when he says chaos is a ladder. He's describing with precise accuracy what chaos had done for him personally. The War of the Five Kings, a catastrophe by any measure, had been for Petyr Baelish the best thing that ever happened to his career. The deaths of Jon Arryn, of Ned Stark, of Renly Baratheon, of eventually Joffrey, each one removed a stabilizing force and created a new vacuum. Each vacuum needed someone to fill it. And he had spent 20 years making himself available to fill exactly this kind of vacuum. Chaos isn't a pit. That's not a general statement. That's his biography.
This is the claim that breaks everything open. And to understand it, you need to understand what he's contrasting it against. They cling to the realm, or the gods, or love, illusions. He's not saying these things don't exist. He's saying they are not load-bearing. They feel real. They feel stable. They feel like the actual structure of reality, but they aren't. They are things people tell themselves so they can bear the knowledge of how power actually works. They are comforting fictions that make the brutal arithmetic of political reality bearable to live in. The realm is an abstraction. It doesn't have feelings or loyalties. It doesn't protect people who serve it. It exists as a concept that people in power use to justify their power. I do this for the realm, which means I do this in a way that happens to preserve my position while being describable as self-sacrifice. Varys genuinely believed in the realm. Littlefinger watched Varys for years and concluded that this belief, sincere as it was, made Varys slower and less effective than he might otherwise have been. Morality as a constraint, the realm as a chain. The gods. Here the argument is simpler and more brutal. If the gods were real in the sense of actually intervening in the world to protect the just and punish the wicked, Petyr Baelish would have been struck down in Season 1. He was not. The gods, if they exist in this world, watch the fall of good men without intervention. Ned Stark prayed. The sept took his head. The gods are either absent or indifferent. Either way, they are not a resource. Love. This one lands hardest because Littlefinger is not saying love is fake. He knows what love is. He loved Catelyn Tully with a completeness that lasted decades and survived her marriage, her children, her physical removal from his life, her death. He knows precisely what love is, and his conclusion, after a lifetime of evidence, is that love makes you weaker, not in the sentimental way, in the operational way. Love creates the people you won't sacrifice, the places you won't go, the moves you won't make. It introduces friction into an otherwise frictionless system, and friction is the enemy of climbing. Illusions doesn't mean things that feel nothing. It means things that feel load-bearing but aren't. Structural wallpaper, beautiful, comforting, and incapable of holding weight when the real pressure comes. Only the latter is real.
Here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. He's not entirely wrong. I want to be careful here because the correct response to Littlefinger's worldview has some validity is not to agree with the worldview. The correct response is to understand exactly what's true in it and exactly where it breaks, because that's how you actually engage with something rather than just dismiss it. What's true, stability does reproduce inequality. The existing order in Westeros, in any feudal system, in most hierarchical systems, is not neutral. It systematically advantages the already advantaged. The mechanisms that maintain order also maintain the people at the top of the order. Pater Baelish was excluded from that system not because he lacked capability, but because of the accident of his birth. His diagnosis of the system was accurate. The system was unjust. Its stability was the stability of injustice. What's true, the people who cling to the realm or abstract principles often use those principles for cover for self-interest without acknowledging it. Littlefinger watching Ned Stark invoke honor while making politically catastrophic decisions, that was a real observation about a real failure mode of virtue-based thinking. Honor without strategic intelligence can be a weapon you hand to your enemies. What's true, people do make catastrophically self-defeating choices in the name of love and loyalty. Catelyn's arrest of Tyrion, Robb Stark's marriage to Talisa in violation of his sworn oath to the Freys. These were not the decisions of people thinking clearly. They were the decisions of people whose emotional commitments overrode their strategic judgment, and the consequences were devastating. But here's where it breaks. Here's the crack in the foundation of the whole philosophy. Littlefinger's worldview works perfectly as long as the ladder is always there to climb. It has no mechanism for what you do when you've reached the top, no concept of what the top even is. Because if the climb is all there is, then arriving is impossible by definition. You don't reach a destination, you just climb. And climbing forever is not a life, it's a compulsion dressed as a philosophy. More importantly, his worldview has no account of what happens when the things he dismissed as illusions turn out to be structural. When it turns out that love, specifically, the human capacity for genuine, irrational, uncalculating attachment, is not just a feeling, but a network. When the people who love each other coordinate in ways that cannot be anticipated through leverage analysis, because the coordination runs on a frequency his instruments can't read. Sansa and Arya loved each other.
Imperfectly, complicated by years of distance and different experiences, but when Littlefinger tried his signature move, driving wedges, exploiting fractures, manufacturing suspicion between sisters, he hit a wall he had no model for. Not because they were smarter than him, because they trusted each other in a way that didn't run through the logic of individual interest that all his calculations assumed. He had a model for everyone except people who genuinely loved each other and wouldn't let him into the space between them. The philosophy's fatal flaw was that it was built entirely on the assumption that everyone ultimately operates from individual interest, that all relationships are instrumental at some level, that the difference between him and other people was just honesty about the instrumentalism everyone was doing anyway. He was wrong. Not about everyone, but about enough people that it eventually killed him.
I want to spend a moment on the craft of this speech, not just what it says, but how it's deployed, because showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss and writer Brian Cogman constructed something genuinely sophisticated here, and it often gets treated as just a quotable monologue when it's doing much more than that. The episode is called The Climb. It opens with Sam and Gilly making their way through the cold north. It contains Jon Snow and the wildlings literally climbing the wall. The title is doing double work. It names a physical act, scaling ice, and a philosophical position, Littlefinger's ladder speech. What Benioff and Weiss are doing is placing Littlefinger's philosophy against a broader canvas, against the wall, which is one of the largest physical structures in the known world, built at enormous human cost to hold back a threat that most people in power have stopped believing is real. The people climbing the wall literally in this episode, the wildlings, Jon, are doing it for survival, for loyalty, for love. They are not climbing for advantage. They are climbing because there is no other option. Littlefinger thinks the only climb is his. He thinks everyone is ultimately doing what he's doing, pursuing advantage, managing leverage, climbing toward power. The wall says otherwise. There are people climbing toward things that have nothing to do with the ladder, and his philosophy, for all its internal coherence, has no place for them. This is what great television writing looks like. The episode title is a refutation of the monologue, delivered silently through structure. You don't need to argue against Littlefinger's worldview. You just need to show, in the same episode, other people for whom it's simply not true. Now, I want to give you something that the show, for reasons of narrative compression, almost entirely left out. And it's the piece that makes the chaos is a ladder speech feel less like nihilism and more like a genuine long-term plan. In George R.R. Martin's novels, the most recent of which, featuring Littlefinger prominently, is A Feast for Crows, published in 2005, Peter Baelish is not simply riding chaos opportunistically. He is building toward a specific endgame, and the endgame is staggering in its patience and its scope. Here is the structure of the plan, as best as it can be reconstructed from the books. Robin Arryn is the current Lord of the Eyrie and head of House Arryn. He is sickly, erratic, emotionally dependent on Littlefinger, and unlikely to survive to old age. When Robin dies, and the plan seems to assume he will, though from what cause Martin leaves deliberately ambiguous, the Vale will need a new lord. The heir is Harry Harding. He's young, handsome, relatively well-liked, and completely without political cunning. He has no idea what's coming.
Littlefinger is arranging for Harry to marry Elaine Stone, who is, secretly, Sansa Stark in disguise. When the marriage happens, Elaine Stone is revealed to be Sansa Stark. Suddenly, Harry Harding is not just Lord of the Vale, he is the husband of the last legitimate Stark heir, with a claim on Winterfell and the entire North. With the Knights of the Vale behind him, and Sansa as the banner that could unite northern loyalists, the combined force could reclaim the North in Sansa's name. And who controls all of this? Who arranged the marriages, managed the alliances, placed every piece on the board? Who does Harry Harding have to thank for his elevated position? Who does Sansa depend on for protection and guidance? Peter Baelish, Lord Protector, the man who holds all the threads. He doesn't need to sit on the Iron Throne. He never wanted to sit on the Iron Throne, exactly. Sitting on a throne makes you visible, makes you the target, makes you the person everyone else is scheming against. What he wanted was to be the person behind whoever sits on the throne, the indispensable advisor, the man without whom the whole structure falls apart, the power that doesn't look like power because it's one step removed from the crown. The ladder, in his schema, leads not to the throne, it leads to the position from which the throne can be operated. The show abandoned this entirely, but Martin is still writing it. And if he ever finishes, and that is genuinely uncertain, and we should be honest about that, what he delivers may be the most complete portrait of political intelligence, its logic, and its limits that the fantasy genre has ever produced.
To understand what Sansa is to Littlefinger, you have to go back to what Catelyn was. Not the relationship in broad strokes. We've covered that in earlier chapters, but the specific texture of it, what it actually felt like from his side, because the emotional logic of what he does with Sansa is only legible once you understand the shape of the wound Catelyn left. He loved her since childhood, since Riverrun, since the years when he was small and out of place, and she was kind to him in the way you're kind to something you find harmless and a little sad. He orbited her for years, convinced with the irrational certainty of adolescent devotion that what he felt was being felt back, or would be eventually if he just waited long enough and made himself useful enough and proved himself sufficiently. Then Brandon Stark arrived, tall and easy in his inheritance, wearing his claim to Winterfell the way Petyr wore his inadequacy, without thinking about it, because he'd never had to. And Lord Hoster Tully arranged a betrothal, and Petyr fought a duel he had no business fighting, and Catelyn begged for his life, and that plea, that mercy extended from pity, not love, was the ending. He was sent away. He understood in the cold silence of the journey back from Riverrun that he had been completely, permanently, categorically wrong. She had never loved him. She had never been going to love him. She had tolerated him with the warmth you extend to a harmless fixture, and when the fixture had embarrassed itself publicly, she had protected it the way you protect something fragile from its own stupidity. That was all. Most people who survive that kind of rejection are broken by it for a while, and then they heal, and then they move on. Petyr Baelish never moved on. He metabolized the wound differently. He converted it with extraordinary efficiency into purpose. The love didn't die, it inverted. It became the engine of everything he built. Every scheme, every political move, every carefully assembled instrument of power was, on some level, an argument to a woman who would never hear it. Look what I became without you. Look what I built from what you threw away. And then Catelyn died at the Twins, in the chaos and the blood, and the music turned wrong. She died, and 40 years of sublimated argument suddenly had no audience. And he looked at Sansa.
George R. Martin, not through a character, not through subtext, but explicitly in an interview, described his version of Littlefinger's feelings about Sansa with a precision that I think deserves to be quoted directly and then held at arm's length for examination. He said, "Half the time he thinks she's the daughter he never had, that he wishes he had if he'd married Catelyn, and half the time he thinks she is Catelyn and he wants her for himself." Read that again. Half father figure, half substitute lover, simultaneously, at the same time, in the same room, looking at the same face. Martin is not describing a man who is confused about his own feelings. He is describing a man whose feelings exist in two registers at once, who genuinely cannot separate them, not because he lacks self-awareness, but because the two feelings are rooted in the same original source. Sansa is Catelyn's daughter. She has Catelyn's face and Catelyn's grace and Catelyn's particular brand of composure under pressure. She is, in the most literal biological sense, what a child of Catelyn's would be. And she is also not Catelyn. She is young, unfinished, reachable in ways her mother never was. The dual register is not a choice, it is the psychological truth of what happens when a person who has loved one person for their entire adult life encounters a living echo of that person after the original is gone. The feelings don't neatly separate, they fuse, they oscillate, they produce something that is genuinely neither pure fatherly feeling nor pure desire, but something unsettling in between, something that has no clean name and that is, by its nature, incapable of being what Sansa actually needed. This is not a defense. I want to be clear about that. What Littlefinger does with Sansa, the possession, the projection, the use of her grief and vulnerability as entry points for his own agenda, is damaging regardless of the sincerity of the feeling underneath it. The genuineness of the care does not make it less a form of violence. Often it makes it more. But I do think understanding it is important, because the version of Littlefinger who is simply predatory, who looks at Sansa and sees only an asset to exploit, a body to possess, a name to weaponize, is a less interesting and less accurate version than the one Martin actually wrote. The Martin version is a man whose care is real and also completely incapable of functioning as care should function, because it is aimed at a ghost wearing his daughter's face. That is harder to look at, and it's more worth looking at.
Here's where the relationship gets genuinely complex. Because alongside everything else, the projection, the possession, the distorted mirror of Catelyn, there is something real that Peter Baelish gives Sansa Stark, something she could not have gotten anywhere else, something that, in the specific brutal context of the game she was trapped in, may have been the most valuable thing anyone gave her in the entire series. He taught her how to think. Not just tactically, not just here is how you survive a specific threat. He taught her the underlying architecture,
how power actually circulates, why people in positions of strength behave the way they do, what desire looks like when it's being performed versus when it's genuine, how to read a room, not the surface, the performance layer, but the structure underneath. Who needs what? Who fears what? Who is pretending to be more comfortable than they are? Watch Season 4, Mockingbird, The Mountain and the Viper, the scenes in the Vale. There is a specific shift in how Sansa holds herself after she arrives under Littlefinger's protection. She is learning, not in the abstract way of someone being lectured, but in the operational way of someone watching a master practitioner work in real time. Every interaction she observes with him is a case study. The way he handles the Lords of the Vale, the way he manages Robin Arryn's erratic behavior, the way he performs loyalty while assembling leverage. She is watching all of it and filing it. There is a scene in Season 4, Episode 10, The Children, that is one of the most important scenes in the series for understanding where Sansa ends up. She comes down the stairs of the Eyrie, hair changed, dressed differently, darker, deliberately different from the innocent auburn-haired girl who arrived there. And Littlefinger is watching her, and his expression in that moment contains something that actors usually call recognition. He sees himself in her. He sees what he made. He sees what she is becoming. He built a student and forgot to ask whether students eventually graduate. The specific things she absorbs from him, how to perform a feeling you don't have, how to make someone think they're getting more information than they are, how to use another person's expectations as a weapon, to let them see what they want to see, to give them enough to keep them comfortable while your actual intentions remain invisible. These are his signature techniques, and she learns them by proximity, by observation, by years of watching a master do it while being close enough to feel the temperature of every exchange. She learns so well that by Season 7, she is running a version of his own playbook back at him, and he doesn't recognize it in time.
Season 4, Episode 7, Mockingbird. The same episode as Lysa's death through the moon door. Just before the moon door scene, there is a scene in the snow of the Eyrie's gardens where Sansa has built a model of Winterfell in the snow. Littlefinger comes to her. They talk. He tells her how much she resembles her mother. He kisses her. It is, by any reasonable measurement, a violation. She is young. He is her guardian. The power differential is total. There is no context in which this is acceptable. But I want to describe what it reveals about him, because the scene is doing something precise that gets lost if you just read it as predatory behavior and move on. In the moment before the kiss, he is talking about Catelyn. He is telling Sansa about her mother, with a quality in his voice, measured, but something barely contained underneath, that is not the voice of a schemer managing a conversation. It is the voice of a man who spent 40 years not being able to say this to anyone. He is speaking to Sansa and looking at Catelyn, and the two things have, in that moment, collapsed into each other completely. He is not thinking about strategy. He is not thinking about what this costs him or what it produces. He is briefly, fully, catastrophically in the grip of the thing he has spent his whole life refusing to let overwhelm him. And Lysa sees it from the window, which is what triggers her breakdown, which leads to the moon door scene, which leads to her death. So the kiss impulsive, wrong, a complete failure of the control he almost never loses, costs him Lysa within hours. It was the moment when the grief and the longing and the projection all overflowed just once, and the overflow produced exactly the crisis his discipline had spent decades preventing. He kissed Sansa because he needed to, not as a scheme, as a compulsion. And that distinction between the schemer who always chooses and the man who sometimes cannot is the crack in the foundation that eventually brings him down. Not in that scene, not immediately, but the pattern is there. He cannot fully separate Sansa from Catelyn. He cannot fully see her as a person distinct from the ghost he's projecting onto her. And that incapacity will eventually be the specific thing that Sansa exploits. You can't truly know someone you're not truly seeing.
Now, I want to give you something that most show viewers never got, and it is, in my honest assessment, the most fascinating and the most psychologically rich version of this relationship in the entire story. Because the show collapsed and distorted the Sansa-Littlefinger dynamic in ways that made it simpler and, I would argue, less true to what Martin is actually doing. In the books, specifically in A Feast for Crows, the most recent novel to center Littlefinger and Sansa, Sansa has been living in the Vale for years under the alias Elaine Stone. Not as a guest, not as a ward kept at arm's length, as his bastard daughter, his acknowledged, publicly named, functionally adopted daughter. Think about what that means for a second. He has constructed an identity for her, a name, a backstory, a relationship to him, and she has had to inhabit it day after day in a place where everyone knows her as Elaine. She calls him father, in public, in front of the lords of the Vale, the servants of the Eyrie, Robin Arryn. She calls him father, and he calls her daughter, and they maintain this fiction with the practiced ease of people who have been doing it long enough that the edges have blurred. Martin, in the Elaine chapters, writes this relationship with a deliberately uncomfortable intimacy. There are moments where Littlefinger looks at her in ways the text flags as wrong, moments where the father-daughter performance seems to slide towards something else, moments where Sansa's internal narration registers a discomfort she can't fully name. But there are also moments of genuine warmth, genuine instruction, genuine care, genuine pleasure in her company that don't read as pure performance. He is teaching her, actively, intentionally, and with a sophistication that goes beyond survival tips. He explains to her how power works in the Vale, how the Lord's declarant can be managed, how Robin Arryn's dependency can be used rather than fought, how information flows and where the leverage points are. He is, in the books, genuinely grooming her, in the political sense before the other sense, to eventually step into a role of real power. The plan, as I outlined in the previous chapter, engineer a marriage between Elaine Stone and Harry Harding, heir to the Eyrie. Then reveal Elaine as Sansa Stark. Sansa Stark married to the Lord of the Vale, with the Knights of the Vale behind them, claiming the North in her name, and behind all of it, invisible but load-bearing, Peter Baelish. He is building her a kingdom. He is building it as a gift and as a trap simultaneously. Because the kingdom only functions if she remains his, if she remains Elaine Stone enough to need him, if Catelyn's daughter stays reachable in ways Catelyn never was. In Martin's hands, this is a tragedy written at a cellular level. He is giving her everything: power, protection, a future, a plan, an education in the only things that actually keep people alive in Westeros. And every gift is a chain.
Because what he cannot do, what his psychology structurally prevents him from doing, is let her be actually free. The protection and the possession are the same gesture. The care and the control are the same hand. And Sansa, the Sansa of the books, who is still there, still in the Vale, still calling him father in front of strangers, is absorbing all of it, learning all of it, becoming by degrees someone capable of seeing past it. Martin has said, without revealing specifics, that Sansa's arc in the remaining books is going to involve her fully coming into her own understanding of the game, that the lessons she learns from Littlefinger will ultimately be turned against him, that the reckoning when it comes will not be the rushed trial scene of the show, but something slower, more quietly devastating, something that arrives as the best of Littlefinger's own schemes always did, long after the trap was already sprung. That broke my brain a little, because it means the most fitting end for Peter Baelish, a man who survived everything through patience and foresight, may be defeat by a student patient enough and perceptive enough to beat him with his own methods. Not Arya's speed, not Bran's omniscience, Sansa's understanding. He taught her too well, and he will never see it coming because he has never been able to see her clearly. She will always, for him, be partly Catelyn's ghost, and you cannot run your most reliable manipulation on someone who you are simultaneously incapable of reading accurately.
I have to address this because it is the single most significant departure from the source material in the entire series, specifically regarding Littlefinger, and it is a departure that flattens the character in ways that still frustrate me years later. Season 5, Littlefinger delivers Sansa to Ramsay Bolton. George R.R. Martin has commented on this, not subtly. He has said in terms that leave very little room for interpretation that his version of Littlefinger would never have done this, would never have been capable of doing this. The exact phrasing I keep returning to is from a 2015 interview where Martin said, "My Littlefinger would have never turned Sansa over to Ramsay. Never. He's obsessed with her." The word is obsessed, not fond, not strategically attached, obsessed, in the way that Lysa was obsessed with him, with the specific, irrational, non-negotiable quality of an attachment that has become the organizing principle of a psychology. Sansa is, for Book Littlefinger, the one thing in the world he will not put at risk. She is simultaneously his most valuable strategic asset and the closest thing he has to something he actually loves. And Ramsay Bolton was known by the time of the show's Season 5 timeline for what he did to people, specifically what he did to women. Book Littlefinger would have known. He always knows. And a man who spent 40 years protecting the ghost of Catelyn Tully in his memory would not hand the living echo of that ghost to a man like Ramsay. He could not strategically, not psychologically, not in any configuration of the character that Martin has actually built. What the show did was sacrifice Sansa's arc, reduce her to a victim of plot-mandated suffering in order to return her to Winterfell for narrative convenience, and in doing so, it stripped Littlefinger of the one constraint that made him human, the one line he wouldn't cross, which wasn't an ethical constraint. He had no reliable ethics. It was an emotional one. He loved her, and love, even distorted and projected and wrong-shaped as his was, is still a constraint. It still means there are places you won't go. The show removed that constraint to serve a plot, and the result was a Littlefinger who was not just diminished, but categorically different, a man capable of handing the thing he most valued in the world to someone who would destroy it for reasons the show never satisfactorily explained. That is not the character Martin wrote. It is a lesser version, built for expediency, who wears his face. Here's why this matters beyond just book versus show grievance. The constraint is what makes him a tragedy rather than a monster. A man with no lines at all is just a monster. A man with one line, one irrational, unjustifiable, utterly non-strategic place where his coldness breaks and something human shows, is a tragedy. Because that break is the evidence of the wound. That unwillingness to cross one specific threshold is the scar tissue from the duel at River Run, from the banishment, from 40 years of carrying something that had nowhere to go. The show wanted a monster. Martin wrote a man.
I want to spend the last section of this chapter on the thing the show did get right, because there is a version of the Sansa-Littlefinger dynamic in the series that is genuinely compelling, genuinely true, and genuinely worth sitting with. The version about what she becomes because of what he taught her. Think about who Sansa Stark is at the beginning of the series. She is 11 in the books, a little older in the show. She has been raised on songs about knights and honor and courtly love. She genuinely believes, with the complete unironic faith of someone who has been given reason not to, that the world works the way songs say it works. Good people are recognized, honorable lords keep their word, suffering is temporary, and beauty and virtue are their own protection. The show takes her through a specific curriculum of brutal disillusionment, Ned's execution, Joffrey's cruelty, the abuse she endures at court, the Red Wedding. Each experience is an empirical lesson that the world does not work the way the song said it works, and she is a quick learner because she has to be. But the theoretical understanding of the game, not just the world is cruel, but this is specifically how power circulates, and here is how to navigate it, comes from Littlefinger. He is her education in mechanics. He shows her not just that people lie, but why specific people lie in specific ways at specific moments. Not just that power exists, but how it moves, where it concentrates, what it costs to access, and what it costs to ignore. By season 6, Sansa is running interference between Jon and the Northern Lords in ways that demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of politics that she did not have in season 1 and did not learn from Ned, who was constitutionally incapable of teaching it. By season 7, she is executing a counter-manipulation against the most experienced manipulator in the realm, and executing it successfully. That arc, from the girl who believed in songs to the woman who out-Littlefinger's Littlefinger, is one of the most complete character transformations in the series, and it is uncomfortably built on a foundation of damage. She learned from him because he had access to her at her most vulnerable. He had access because he had, over years, accumulated her trust and her dependency. The education was real. The cost of the education was real. You cannot cleanly separate the two. This is the thing about Peter Baelish's legacy in Sansa's life that sits in my chest with a particular weight every time I think about it. He gave her the tools she needed to survive, genuinely. The Sansa who navigates the political wreckage of Westeros after Peter Littlefinger's death is a different creature from the one who arrived in King's Landing in season 1, and the difference is, in significant part, his doing. And the tools he gave her were forged in the heat of his inability to see her clearly.
He taught her how to read people, how to look beneath performance and see the want or fear underneath, but never fully applied that capacity to her, because she was Catelyn's ghost, and he couldn't read Catelyn either. He could only love her and lose her and love the echo. She learned to read. He taught her, without meaning to, how to read him.
There is a scene, Season 2, Episode 1, The North Remembers, where Littlefinger and Varys pass each other in the corridor outside the small council chamber and exchange maybe 6 lines of dialogue. It goes like this. Varys: Lord Baelish, I was grievously sorry to hear about your difficulties. Littlefinger: I was grievously sorry to experience them. Varys: Alas, the contents of one's bed can become thorny political matters. Littlefinger: And yet so much better to be the rose than the thorn. They part. Scene over. 9 seconds of screen time, maybe 12. I have watched this exchange at least 20 times, and every time I notice something different, a new layer of what's happening beneath the words. Because what looks like 2 courtiers exchanging polished small talk is actually 2 of the most sophisticated intelligence operatives in the realm conducting a mutual threat assessment in real time. Every word is a probe, every response is a countermove, every smile is a calculation wearing a human face. They are each, in those 9 seconds, learning something about what the other one knows, and learning it without revealing that they're trying to learn it. That exchange is what every Littlefinger Varys scene is, not conversation, espionage. 2 men who have spent decades becoming experts at reading people, now trained on each other, each fully aware that the other is doing exactly what they're doing. And what makes it extraordinary, what makes the rivalry between these 2 characters the most intellectually charged dynamic in the series, is that underneath all the mutual surveillance and the chess game of positioning, there is a genuine, irresolvable philosophical disagreement, not about tactics, not about methods, about what power is for. That's what this chapter is about.
I want to spend time on Varys specifically, because he tends to get flattened in analyses of this dynamic into the good one, the counterpart to Littlefinger's scheming, the man with a conscience, the contrast who makes Littlefinger's amorality visible. That framing is too simple. It does Varys a disservice, and it makes the philosophical confrontation between them shallower than it actually is. Varys is not good, not in the simple sense. He is capable of extraordinary ruthlessness. He has ordered deaths. He has manipulated people with complete cynicism about their personal cost to them. He has stood by while terrible things happened to specific people because the calculation required their suffering for a larger end. He is not someone you would want operating on you without your consent, which is, of course, exactly what he does to everyone he touches. What Varys has, the thing that makes him genuinely different from Littlefinger and not just superficially more sympathetic, is a cause that exists outside himself. He works toward something, a vision, the realm specifically, not as an abstraction, but as a specific population of people, the small folk, the ordinary men and women who suffer most when the lords play their games and the wars ignite and the harvests fail. He has named to himself and occasionally to others who he is doing all of this for, and the fact that the cause sometimes requires him to do monstrous things does not invalidate the cause. It makes it more honest. He is not pretending that working toward a better world is clean work. This matters because it means that when Varys looks at Littlefinger, he is not looking at himself. He is looking at a specific kind of void, a man with the same skills, the same intelligence, the same background of outsider deprivation, all the same inputs that produced Varys's commitment to the realm, and who came the other side with nothing, no cause, no direction, no vision of anything beyond the personal. Just the climb, infinite and self-referential, going nowhere except up and up forever. And that void, Varys understood, was the most dangerous thing he had ever encountered, because it meant there was no ceiling, no point at which Littlefinger would say, "Enough, this is what I wanted, here I stop." A man with a cause eventually reaches a condition that satisfies it. A man with only appetite can never be satisfied. And an unsatisfiable man with Littlefinger's specific capabilities and willingness to use them is by definition an existential threat to anything anyone is trying to build.
Let me lay out exactly how similar these two men are on the surface, because the similarity is load-bearing for understanding what makes them different. Both came from nothing. This is not a minor biographical detail. It is the foundational condition of everything they became. Varys was born into slavery, not the soft bondage of servitude, but actual property, owned, traded, used. He was sold to a traveling magician who castrated him in a ritual that the show only alludes to and the books describe with deliberate restraint. He survived by becoming indispensable, by cultivating information, by threading himself into the fabric of every court he encountered until he was too embedded to remove. He arrived in King's Landing with nothing and built the most comprehensive intelligence apparatus in the realm. Littlefinger was born to a family so minor it barely had a name. His great-grandfather was a foreign mercenary. His family seat was a tower that he contemptuously called the Drear Fort. He was fostered at River Run as a charity case, mocked, dismissed, nearly killed in a duel nobody thought he should have survived, and banished. He started as a minor customs official in a port city that great lords flew past on the way to somewhere that mattered. He arrived in King's Landing with nothing and built the second most comprehensive intelligence apparatus in the realm. Both operate entirely through information and leverage. Neither commands armies, neither relies on martial strength. Both use what people want and fear as the primary currency of their trade. Both have built over decades networks of ordinary people, servants, merchants, functionaries, workers in the infrastructure of daily life, who most aristocrats would never think to cultivate, precisely because their social conditioning prevents them from seeing value in people without titles. Both sit at the highest councils of power while being institutionally its outsiders. Varys has no house. Littlefinger has a house that barely qualifies. Neither belongs to the world they inhabit by any of the criteria that world officially recognizes. They are both, in the most literal sense, men who built themselves into positions that should not have been accessible to them. In a different story, they would be allies, obvious allies. Two men from nothing, in a world that despises them for it, who figured out how power actually works and used that knowledge to make themselves indispensable to a system that was built to exclude them. There is a version of the Littlefinger-Varys dynamic that is one of the great partnerships in political fiction. But here's the thing. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. They are not allies. They are functionally enemies, and the reason they are enemies has nothing to do with personal animosity and everything to do with the fact that what each of them is building is structurally incompatible with what the other one is building.
Varys, in the Season 2 scene in the throne room, the one where he and Littlefinger circle each other in front of the Iron Throne in what is probably the most explicitly ideological scene in the series, says something that functions as the thesis of his entire existence. I did what I did for the good of the realm. And Littlefinger, not missing a beat, the realm. Do you know what the realm is? It's the 1,000 blades of Aegon's enemies, a story we agree to tell each other over and over until we forget it's a lie. This is not banter. This is the clearest articulation the show ever gives us of the core disagreement between these two men, and it's worth taking seriously rather than just treating as memorable dialogue. Littlefinger's claim is philosophical, not cynical. He is making an argument about the nature of political legitimacy, that the realm as a concept is a constructed fiction, a shared story, something that exists because people agree to behave as if it exists, not because it has any objective reality. The Iron Throne is a chair made of swords. The rules of succession are things men invented and other men follow. There is no cosmic authority behind any of it. It is all, at its foundation, a collective performance. This is not entirely wrong, and that's the uncomfortable thing about it. Political theorists from Hobbes to Rousseau to contemporary institutional economists have made versions of exactly this argument, that political order is constructed, contingent, maintained by consent and belief rather than by anything metaphysically fixed. Littlefinger is making a specific, defensible philosophical claim about the nature of social institutions. But then he concludes, therefore, the only thing that is real is power, personal, individual, accumulated power. Not the realm, not the institution, the man at the center of it. And here is where the argument, for all its surface cleverness, makes its catastrophic error. Varys' counter-argument, delivered not in that scene but through the accumulated weight of everything he does across the series, is this: even if the realm is a constructed fiction, the suffering it prevents or produces is not. The small folk who die in wars over the succession are not dying for a fiction. They are dying in reality, from real wounds, in real pain, leaving real families. The question of who sits on the throne matters, not because the throne is sacred, but because governance is the allocation of suffering. Who gets to avoid it? Who gets crushed by it? Who gets to live through the winter and who doesn't? The realm is a fiction in its legitimacy. It is not a fiction in its consequences. Littlefinger's philosophy treats the constructed nature of political institutions as a license for pure self-interest. Varys's philosophy treats it as a responsibility. If the order is constructed, then the question of how it is constructed and toward whose benefit is not a fixed thing, but an ongoing choice. A choice that people with their specific capabilities have an obligation to make thoughtfully. They are both right about what the realm is. They are irreconcilably different about what that means.
Let's get concrete, because the philosophical disagreement is only legible against the specific operational competition they were running simultaneously. Both men had intelligence networks, but the structures were different in ways that reflected their different purposes. Varys's network, the little birds, the children he cultivated across King's Landing and beyond, was built for breadth and for purpose. He wanted to know what was happening everywhere, with an emphasis on threats to stability, threats to the small folk, developments that would affect the realm's capacity to function. His information was organized around a cause. He collected what he needed to protect what he cared about. Littlefinger's network, the brothels, the financial connections, the web of ordinary people placed in administrative positions across the realm, was built for leverage. He collected what people wanted and feared, specifically, individually, personally. His intelligence wasn't primarily about events. It was about individuals, about the specific debt, the specific shame, the specific longing that could be activated when needed. They are two different theories of intelligence, reflecting two different theories of power. Varys's theory: information about the world allows you to intervene effectively in it. Know what's happening, know what's coming, deploy the right response at the right moment. Littlefinger's theory: information about people allows you to control them. Know what each specific individual wants and fears, and you own their choices without ever needing to compel them directly. In practice, each method had blind spots that the other exploited. Varys was most vulnerable to Littlefinger's method, to the manipulation of specific individuals whose desires he had not fully mapped. Rose's double agent role is the clearest example. Varys cultivated her as an informant without fully accounting for the fact that Littlefinger would discover the arrangement and respond not by blocking it, but by passing her to Joffrey as a disposable object lesson. Varys had mapped the geopolitical situation accurately. He had not fully mapped what Littlefinger was willing to do to a specific person. Littlefinger was most vulnerable to Varys's method, to broad situational awareness that caught the edges of his schemes. Varys knew broadly what Littlefinger was doing. He couldn't always stop it, but he could limit it, could prepare countermoves, could ensure that the most catastrophic outcomes were mitigated. The problem was that mitigation was all Varys could usually manage, because Littlefinger's schemes were so embedded in the autonomous choices of other people that dismantling them required either time or the willingness to harm innocents, and Varys's purpose-driven framework was genuinely constrained by its moral commitments in ways that Littlefinger's framework was not. This is where it gets uncomfortable. Littlefinger's methods were more effective in the short run, precisely because his absence of moral constraint made him more flexible. He could do things Varys couldn't,
Not because Varys lacked the intelligence or the capability, because Varys had decided there were people he would not sacrifice, lines he would not cross, costs he would not pay, and Littlefinger had no such list.
I want to sit with the most damning thing Varys ever said about Littlefinger, because it's a sentence that I think most people hear as a strong line and then move past without fully absorbing what it reveals about the person saying it. Varys to Lady Olenna Tyrell regarding Petyr Baelish. He would see this country burn if he could be king of the ashes. Now, Varys has said many precise and devastating things across 8 seasons, but this one is different. Because Varys, in this line, is not just describing Littlefinger's ambition. He is describing a specific quality of Littlefinger's psychology that Varys, who is himself no stranger to ruthlessness, recognizes as alien. Varys had made sacrifices. He had arranged deaths. He had manipulated people in ways that cost them dearly. He was not a gentle man or a naive one. He knew exactly how much damage the pursuit of a political goal required, and he had paid that cost with something like honesty about what it meant. But he had done it for something. Every harm he inflicted was in service of a purpose larger than himself. The damage was in service of an end that existed outside his own desire. That is not comfortable, but it is a recognizable moral structure. The utilitarian calculation that a specific harm is justified by a larger good. Littlefinger had no such structure. That's what King of the Ashes means. Not that he would cause destruction as an unfortunate side effect of his ambition, but that the destruction was, on some level, the point. That a Westeros in ruins, with himself atop the rubble, satisfied the wound that a Westeros fully functioning had inflicted on him. The ashes were not collateral. They were the argument. Varys understood this with something close to horror, because a man with no purpose beyond himself is not just dangerous in the ordinary way that ambitious people are dangerous. He is dangerous in a way that cannot be negotiated with, cannot be redirected, cannot be satisfied. There is no offer you can make him that ends the threat. There is no arrangement that produces a situation in which Petyr Baelish stops, because stopping would require arriving, and arriving would require there to be somewhere to arrive, and the philosophy of the latter has no destination. That is what frightened Varys. Not Littlefinger's competence, his inexhaustibility.
Here is the thing about this rivalry that I find most fascinating and that the show captures in fragments without ever quite stating directly. They were the only people in Westeros capable of fully seeing each other. Everyone else, the lords, the kings, the players of the obvious game, saw Varys and Littlefinger as useful tools, as advisors with unusual skills, as slightly unsettling fixtures of the court whose specific capabilities could be deployed as needed. They didn't see the machinery, they saw the outputs. Varys and Littlefinger saw each other's machinery completely. Each one knew exactly what the other was doing, why, and approximately how. They couldn't always stop it. The machinery was often too embedded, too insulated, too distributed across too many other people's autonomous choices, but they could see it. And in a world where almost nobody could see either of them clearly, that mutual visibility created something unusual. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't respectful, exactly, in the warm sense. It was something more like the specific recognition between two people who share a rare capability, who can look at each other and see the thing that most people cannot see. Two chess players of equal skill watching each other play, each knowing that the other knows. There is a particular loneliness in being unusually capable at something because most of the people around you can't see the game you're playing. Varys and Littlefinger could each see each other's game, and in the strange arithmetic of isolation, that made each of them, despite everything, something like the other's only intellectual peer. Which is precisely what made it tragic. Two men from nothing, two men who had built themselves into positions that should have been impossible. Two men who saw the game more clearly than anyone in Westeros, and they spent their genius on each other. Every move Littlefinger made, Varys had to map and counter. Every network Varys built, Littlefinger had to penetrate and compromise. The greatest political intelligence operation in the history of the Seven Kingdoms was two men mostly canceling each other out while the realm burned around them.
After spending embarrassingly long with a notebook and a remote control, let me give you the specific things to look for when you go back through the Littlefinger Varys scenes, because rewatching them with the philosophical context fully loaded changes almost everything about what you're seeing. Season 1, Episode 5, The Wolf and the Lion. The first substantial scene between them in the throne room where they spar in front of the empty Iron Throne. Watch Littlefinger's eyes specifically. He is scanning. Every line he delivers, he is simultaneously reading Varys' reaction, not for emotional response, but for information. What does Varys know? What is he trying to find out? The lines are probes disguised as wit, and Varys is doing the same thing back. They are each gathering intelligence through a performance of casualness. The throne in the background is not incidental staging. It is the object both men are, in their completely different ways, oriented toward. Season 2, Episode 1, The North Remembers. The throne room confrontation where they both reveal more than they mean to, precisely because each is trying to get the other to reveal something first. Littlefinger's line about the realm being a story, that is not a prepared speech. That is him pressing, seeing if Varys will react to the philosophical provocation, using the argument as a diagnostic tool. And Varys' response, measured, not taking the bait fully, neither confirming nor denying the underlying worldview, tells Littlefinger something about the limits of what can be drawn out through provocation. Season 3, Episode 4, and now his watch is ended. The scene where Varys tells the story of his own castration to Tyrion, ending with the sorcerer trapped in the box. This scene is ostensibly about Varys, but it functions in the context of this rivalry as a statement about patience and about purpose. Varys has been waiting for years, decades for the right moment. The sorcerer in the box is a demonstration of what Varys is willing to wait for. It is, indirectly, a message about what distinguishes him from Littlefinger. The climb has a destination. There is a sorcerer in a box.
Littlefinger's climb has no sorcerer. It has only more climbing. The briefer exchanges in corridors, in council chambers, the glances across rooms read completely differently once you understand the full competitive landscape. Every moment of apparent politeness is intelligence work. Every compliment is a probe. Every smile is a cover for something being recorded. They are never not playing.
Here is the honest assessment of how the rivalry resolves, and I want to be precise rather than just declaring a winner. In the show's timeline, Varys outlasts Littlefinger. Littlefinger dies in Winterfell in Season 7, betrayed by his own student. Varys survives until Season 8, where he is executed by Daenerys for treason when he attempts to act against her. Both men die, ultimately, not at each other's hands, but as collateral of larger forces. Littlefinger to the Stark children he underestimated, Varys to the queen he backed when the alternative seemed worse. Neither man wins, which is, in some sense, the point. Littlefinger's philosophy, the ladder, the climb, the self as the only fixed point, produced a man who was extraordinarily dangerous and who never built anything that lasted. Every structure he created was designed to serve his ascent, and nothing designed purely for ascent has any structural integrity beyond the climber. When he died, his empire, financial, political, personal, dissolved immediately. There was no Baelish heir, no Baelish institution, no Baelish-shaped mark on Westeros that survived him by a single day. He had built brilliantly and built nothing. Varys's philosophy, the realm, the small folk, the purpose larger than himself, produced a man who was extraordinarily patient and who ultimately could not survive the specific form of chaos he had tried to manage. His bet on Daenerys, the long-accumulated plan to return Targaryen rule to Westeros, was a miscalculation that cost him his head. The cause survived. He did not. And the realm he gave his life to ended up, after the final season's events, governed in an arrangement he might or might not have approved of, by people he had only partially shaped. But here is the distinction that matters. When Varys died, the world was slightly different because he had been in it. The trajectory of specific events, the survival of Jon Snow, the containment of certain Lannister schemes, the preservation of certain alliances bore his fingerprints. He had moved things. He had protected things. He had not built a monument to himself. He had built adjustments to a world he cared about. When Littlefinger died, the world was catastrophically different because he had been in it. Hundreds of thousands were dead. The entire political architecture of Westeros had been shattered and imperfectly rebuilt. The War of the Five Kings, his war, started by his specific decisions, produced a generation of trauma, ruin, and loss that shaped everything that followed. He caused more damage. He left less of value. That is the summary of a life spent in service to nothing but the climb. I want to end this chapter with something that doesn't get said often enough about this rivalry, because most analysis treats it as a purely intellectual competition. Two clever men, different goals, see who wins. But there is something genuinely melancholy about it when you sit with it long enough.
These were two men who both arrived in King's Landing from nothing, both shaped by specific deprivations that most of the people they served had never experienced and would never understand. Both were able to see, with a clarity that the highborn could never match, exactly how the machinery of power actually operated, who it served, who it crushed, how it maintained itself, where the leverage points were. Varys, shaped by his deprivation, looked outward, looked at the world that did what it did to him, and decided, I will change the conditions that make this possible. I will work toward a world where children are not sold to sorcerers, where the small folk are not simply the casualties of the games their lords play, where the machinery runs somewhat more justly. He could not fix everything. He did not fix everything, but the direction of his effort was outward, toward people who had nothing to do with his specific pain. Littlefinger, shaped by his deprivation, looked inward, looked at the world that excluded him, and decided, I will take from this world everything it refused to give me. He would have the power. He would have the recognition. He would, eventually, the position that the boy from the smallest finger of the veil was told he could never have. The direction of his effort was inward, toward the healing, or rather the avenging, of his specific wound. Two men from nothing. Two possible responses to being told the world has no place for you. One chose to change the world's conditions. One chose to make the world pay. And here's what I want you to sit with. Neither of them lived to see what they built become what they meant it to be. Varys died before his cause was won. Petyr Baelish died before his personal empire was completed. Both men gave everything, every calculation, every sacrifice, every year of their lives to a project that outlived them only in its consequences, not in its intention. The realm and the ladder, two responses to the same wound, both incomplete. Both are real, both, in the end, insufficient. That is not an argument for nihilism. It is an argument for asking carefully what you're climbing toward and whether the thing at the top is worth what the climb costs everything around you. Varys asked that question. Petyr Baelish never did.
Here is the moment I want you to think about. Season 7, Episode 7, The Dragon and the Wolf. A man who spent 40 years building the most sophisticated intelligence network in the history of Westeros, who started a war with a poisoned cup and a forged letter, who engineered the deaths of a hand of the king, a king's bastard investigator, a royal heir, and his own wife, stands in the great hall of Winterfell and tries to talk his way out of a trap he didn't know he was in. Sansa says his name. Arya steps forward, and Petyr Baelish, the man Varys once called a genuine threat to the stability of the entire realm, starts to cry. He drops to his knees on those cold stones and begs. He makes promises. He constructs arguments. He tries one last time to find the angle, and there isn't one. There is no angle left. The knife opens his throat, and Petyr Baelish is gone. And the debate that has run ever since is this: was that ending earned?
After spending way too many hours on this, rewatching Season 7 3 times specifically for this chapter, going back through the books, going back through interviews with David Benioff, D.B. Weiss, and George R.R. Martin, and genuinely sitting with the discomfort of what that finale scene does and doesn't accomplish, here is where I've landed. The thematic conclusion of Littlefinger's story is one of the most precise, philosophically satisfying character endings in the show's run. The craft of getting there is among the sloppiest writing the show ever did to a major character. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the gap between them is actually the most interesting thing about his death, because that gap tells you something about what the show fundamentally misunderstood about who Peter Baelish was. Let me walk you through it.
Start with what the ending means, because this part is genuinely remarkable. Littlefinger's entire operational philosophy rested on a single premise. People are instruments. Every person in every room had something they wanted and something they feared, and those two things could be converted into levers. You didn't need armies if you had levers. You didn't need loyalty if you had leverage. You didn't need love if you had leverage. You didn't need anything if you had enough leverage on enough people. But there was a corollary assumption baked into this worldview that he never examined because he had no experiential reason to examine it. Loyalty between people is a performance. People claim love and solidarity, but underneath that claim is always the same engine, self-interest. Push hard enough on the right fault lines and any alliance cracks. Any bond can be made to look like a threat. Any sister can be made to see another sister as competition rather than kin. This assumption wasn't cynicism for its own sake. It came from start with what the ending means, because this part is genuinely remarkable. Littlefinger's entire operational philosophy rested on a single premise. People are instruments. Every person in every room had something they wanted and something they feared, and those two things could be converted into levers. You didn't need armies if you had levers. You didn't need loyalty if you had leverage. You didn't need love if you had leverage. You didn't need anything if you had enough leverage on enough people. But there was a corollary assumption baked into this worldview that he never examined because he had no experiential reason to examine it. Loyalty between people is a performance. People claim love and solidarity, but underneath that claim is always the same engine, self-interest. Push hard enough on the right fault lines and any alliance cracks. Any bond can be made to look like a threat. Any sister can be made to see another sister as competition rather than kin. This assumption wasn't cynicism for its own sake. It came from somewhere specific and real. Littlefinger had tried once to operate from love rather than leverage. He had tried to duel Brandon Stark for Catelyn Tully. He had believed for a moment that love was a viable strategy. The result was a near-fatal wound and permanent exile from Riverrun. What he concluded, and this is the tragedy at the center of his character, was that not that he had made a mistake. What he concluded was that love itself was the mistake, that anyone who acted from genuine feeling rather than calculation was writing their own ruin, that the people who clung to bonds of loyalty and affection were, as he said in the throne room speech, clinging to illusions. The fall would break them. It always did. Here's where it gets devastating. Littlefinger was right about most people most of the time. He had spent 40 decades testing this premise, and it had held. Lysa Tully loved him desperately, and he leveraged that love to make her poison her own husband. Ned Stark trusted him from a place of honor, and Littlefinger used that trust to put a blade to his throat. Catelyn Stark grieved her sister's accusatory letter, and Littlefinger rode that grief to ignite a war. He was not operating from ideology. He was operating from a hypothesis that had never once been falsified. Until winter fell.
The Stark sisters were supposed to fracture under the pressure he applied. He planted Sansa's old letter, the one she wrote to Robb under duress in Season 1, begging him to bend the knee to Joffrey, a letter that made her look like a collaborator. He arranged for Arya to find it. He calculated that Arya, trained to read betrayal, would see her sister's past compliance as evidence of present disloyalty. He calculated that Sansa, threatened and uncertain, would feel sufficiently endangered by Arya to consider eliminating her. He had run this play before. He had run variations of it for years. Two people with the same claim, made to see each other as the threat rather than the system they were both trapped in. The problem, the thing his game theory had genuinely never accounted for, was what happened when two people chose each other anyway. Not because it was strategically optimal, not because one of them had something to gain from the other, but because they were sisters and they had survived things together, and that surviving had built something between them that was not susceptible to his particular instrument. He died because he could not model genuine loyalty, not because he hadn't seen enough of it. He'd seen plenty. He'd seen Ned Stark refuse to name himself a traitor, even with the headsman in front of him. He'd seen Catelyn risk everything to rescue Bran. He had categorized all of it as poor strategy, miscalculation, the tragic waste of good material on illusions. He had never once considered that those moments of self-sacrifice were not failures of calculation, but evidence that his model of human motivation was incomplete. Read that again. A man who spent 40 years mastering every mechanism of human desire, and the fundamental error he carried the whole time was that he couldn't believe people were capable of wanting things for someone else's sake rather than their own. That's not a strategic failure. That's a psychological one, rooted in a wound that never healed. And when the Stark sisters turned the table, when Sansa summoned him to the Great Hall not as a suspect, but as a defendant, and Arya was there not as a pawn, but as an executioner, his failure to model loyalty came due all at once. Every play he'd ever run was built on the assumption that the people he was manipulating would ultimately put themselves first. Sansa put Arya first. Arya put Sansa first. The game he'd been running for 40 decades had no move for that. That is extraordinary writing on a thematic level. It is the exact right ending for this specific character. The man who reduced love to a vulnerability was destroyed by love functioning as a strategy. The man who weaponized information was brought down by the one person in the realm who could access information he could not control. Bran Stark, three-eyed raven, living archive of every moment Peter Baelish had chosen to believe no one was watching. The symmetry is precise, justice is earned, the meaning is real.
But here's the thing. The thematic logic being sound doesn't mean the execution was. And this is where I need to be honest with you,
because a lot of commentary on this ending either defends it entirely or condemns it entirely, and neither of those responses is quite right. The specific problem is the Sansa-Arya conflict in the first two-thirds of Season 7. For 3 episodes, Stormborn, the Queen's Justice, and the Spoils of War, we watch what appears to be a genuine fracture developing between the Stark sisters at Winterfell. Sansa arrives to find Sansa managing complex political realities she doesn't fully respect. Sansa struggles to understand the person her sister has become. Littlefinger engineers moments that deepen the mistrust. Arya finds the letter, and her reaction, as played by Maisie Williams, is not met with suspicion. It is visceral, real-looking anger. In Beyond the Wall, the episode immediately before the finale, the tension between them escalates to what genuinely appears to be Arya threatening to take Sansa's face. And then, in The Dragon and the Wolf, we get a sudden reversal. The tribunal scene reveals that the sisters had been running a counterplay on Littlefinger the whole time. The conflict was fake. The trap was set all along. The problem is not that this reversal happens. The problem is that the show gave us no scene, no moment, no single beat that suggested the sisters had spoken privately and agreed to run this operation. We didn't need to see the meeting, but we needed a moment, a look, a line, a scene that in retrospect would allow us to read the apparent conflict as performance rather than reality. The show didn't give us that. What it gave us instead was a genuine-looking conflict and then a script-level retcon. David Benioff and D.B. Weiss has spoken about this in interviews. Their explanation was essentially that they chose to preserve the tension for the audience by withholding the moment where the sisters aligned, because they believed the surprise of the tribunal reveal was worth the price of the apparent narrative gap. They were not trying to mislead viewers. They were making a deliberate craft decision about where to place the dramatic payoff. I understand that decision. I also think it was wrong. Because what it produced was not a dramatically satisfying surprise. It produced a finale that felt to a significant portion of the audience like a rewrite rather than a culmination. The rules of dramatic storytelling, particularly for a show that had spent 7 years training its audience to read subtext, to watch faces carefully, to understand that characters were always playing games within games, the rules required the sisters' alliance to be inferable from what we'd seen, even if not explicit. When the twist comes, we should be able to look back at earlier scenes and see the double meaning. We should be able to say, "Oh, it was there. I missed it." Instead, most viewers said, "When did that happen?" That difference matters. It matters because Littlefinger deserved an opponent who had genuinely outplayed him, not one who appeared to have outplayed him because the show staged a false conflict and then quietly walked it back. Sansa was capable of outplaying him. The book version of Sansa, who has been learning his methods directly under his tutelage for years, who has lived inside his mind as Elaine Stone, who was slowly constructing an understanding of the game that might eventually exceed even his, absolutely could outmaneuver him. And the show's Sansa, who had watched him since King's Landing and survived everything she survived, was also capable of it. But you have to show the outplay. You have to earn it dramatically, not announce it retroactively. This is the gap, right here, between what the story meant and how the story was told.
There's a second issue with the execution that almost everyone mentions, and I want to spend a moment on it because the standard critique of it is actually less interesting than the real critique. The standard critique is Bran's presence as the three-eyed raven made Littlefinger's fall feel cheap because Littlefinger never had a chance once Bran could see everything. You can't be a master of hidden information in a room with an omniscient witness. The moment Bran arrived at Winterfell, Littlefinger was functionally dead. He just didn't know it yet. That critique is technically true, but it misses something. The reason Bran's presence feels like a cheat is not because omniscience is inherently unfair. It's because the show never dramatized Littlefinger encountering it. There is no scene where Littlefinger looks at Bran and feels for the first time the specific discomfort of operating in a room where his advantage, his monopoly on hidden information, no longer exists. There is no moment where his hyper-aware intelligence detects something wrong about the Winterfell situation, something he can't quite explain, a room that doesn't behave the way rooms should. If there had been even one scene of Littlefinger noticing Bran and not being able to read him, one scene where the camera showed us Peter calculating and coming up empty, the final trap would have felt earned. We would have seen him encounter his limitation before we saw his limitation destroy him. And instead, Bran's omniscience is deployed as a plot device in the tribunal and not as a dramatic element in the episodes preceding it. Littlefinger walks into his own execution without ever appearing to sense the ground shifting. And this matters because of what it tells us about the show's understanding of Littlefinger in his final season. Book Littlefinger's genius, and I've covered this in earlier chapters, was that it was invisible. His intelligence operated below the surface. You saw the outcomes, you rarely saw the machinery. That invisibility was the point. It's what made him terrifying. The show's Littlefinger, particularly in seasons 6 and 7, had become increasingly visible. He was conspicuous. His scheming was telegraphed. He lurked in hallways with his signature low-register malice, and you watched him lurk, and the show watched him lurk, and the camera basically told you, this man is plotting. Conspicuous schemers in the world he inhabited don't survive as long as he did. The version of Peter Baelish who made it to season 7 would already have been caught or killed years earlier. The show, by making his menace surface level for dramatic purposes, had inadvertently made it implausible that he'd lasted this long undetected. And here's the implication of that. When Sansa and Arya outmaneuver him in the finale, a significant part of the reason it doesn't feel fully earned is because the season 7 version of Littlefinger had already been subtly diminished. You're not watching the most dangerous intelligence in Westeros be taken down. You're watching a less sharp version of that man be taken down by people he underestimated, which is fine, but it's a lesser victory. It's smaller than it should be. It should have felt like the fall of something genuinely formidable. Instead, it felt like the removal of a threat we'd already half stopped believing in. That diminishment, not the Bran problem, not the sister conflict pacing, but the gradual reduction of Littlefinger's operational subtlety over the show's final seasons, is the actual root of why the ending feels unearned to so many viewers. The execution scene is the right scene. It's just not quite the right character standing in it.
Here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. In the books, Peter Baelish is alive. As of A Feast for Crows, the most recent book to feature him prominently, he is at the height of his power. He is Lord Protector of the Vale. He commands the Knights of the Vale, the largest uncommitted military force still intact in Westeros. Sansa Stark is at his side, disguised as his bastard daughter, Elaine Stone, being slowly taught the mechanics of his operation. He has arranged her betrothal to Harry Harding, the attractive young heir to the Eyrie. He has threads reaching into the Riverlands, where he is installing himself as Lord of Harrenhal and quietly positioning allies.
He has leverage across the Iron Throne. He is arguably the most powerful single individual in Westeros at that moment in the story. And George R.R. Martin is still writing his ending. Martin has said publicly that the book version of Littlefinger's downfall, when it comes, will be different in character from the show's version. He has described it in terms that suggest something more patient, more architectural, not a sudden tribunal, something that builds, something that comes from a direction he doesn't anticipate, arriving through a pathway he himself constructed. Martin's version of defeat for a character like this is almost certainly going to come the way Littlefinger's own schemes always came, disguised, patient, using the trust and the mechanisms he himself built. The trap will be one he laid for someone else, and it will turn on him not because someone was smarter, though they may be, but because he made the same error he always made. He will have underestimated what someone is capable of once they stop being an instrument and start being a person. Most analysts assume that person is Sansa, the book Sansa, who has been living inside his methods for years, learning not just the techniques, but the psychology of how he operates. She knows him how to think in a way that no one else in the series does. She has seen him be vulnerable in moments she suspects he doesn't know she noticed. She has watched him make decisions he believes were opaque, but weren't. She is, in the books, becoming something quietly dangerous, and Littlefinger, who sees her as the closest thing to Catelyn he will ever have again, is not watching her the way he would watch a threat. He is watching her the way he watches something he loves. And that blindness, the one specific, incurable blindness he carried, is what Martin will use. Here's what broke my brain when I put it together. Littlefinger's worldview was that love is the great vulnerability, the thing that makes people predictable and destroys them. And he was largely right. But the love he could never map as a vulnerability, the one blind spot in his entire system, was his own. His love for Catelyn, and by extension Sansa, was the single thing in his architecture that was not strategic. He genuinely could not see it clearly. He genuinely could not instrumentalize it. And it will almost certainly be the structural flaw that brings the whole edifice down. He built his immunity to love as a fortress. Martin is going to show us that it was a cage.
I want to come back to that final moment, because I've spent a lot of this video on the craft failures of Season 7, and I don't want to leave without saying what the begging scene gets exactly right, because it gets something profoundly right. Peter Baelish on his knees, begging. The first thing most people read this as, a powerful man reduced to weakness. The mask falls, the monster was revealed as cowardly at the core. That reading is too simple, and it gives him too little credit. Littlefinger was not a coward. His entire life was a study in running toward danger with calibrated risk assessments rather than away from it. He was not suddenly revealed as physically terrified. What he was revealed as in that moment was genuinely desperate, and the desperation was specific. He was running out of angles, and he knew it, and he was trying the last instrument in his toolkit: emotional appeal, vulnerability performance, the suggestion of remorse, because there was nothing else left to try. Watch his face in those final moments. Aidan Gillen is extraordinary in this scene.
What you're seeing is not the collapse of composure, it's the systematic exhaustion of options. You can almost watch him cycling through strategies. Can I appeal to her mercy? Can I make myself useful? Can I construct a scenario where keeping me alive serves their interests more than killing me? And each one coming up empty in real time. The begging is not the revelation of who he really was beneath the mask. The begging is a continuation of who he always was, a man trying every available option, running every angle until there were no angles left. And here is the thing that is genuinely heartbreaking about it, if you let yourself feel it. The moment he asked Sansa to remember what he felt for her mother, he was being honest, arguably more honest than he had been in any previous scene in the series. The love for Catelyn was real. His grief at losing her was real. His displacement of that grief onto Sansa was disturbed and damaging and wrong in every important sense, but it was real. And in his final moment, with no more moves left, what he reached for was not a lie. He reached for the truth that he had suppressed and weaponized and redirected and corrupted across 4 decades, but which had never fully died in him. That's not a monster reaching for the last tool. That's a man, at the end, finally having nothing left except the thing he'd spent his whole life refusing to be vulnerable about. Sansa's mercy was the one thing the man who built himself on leverage could not leverage his way into. And the look on her face in that moment, not cruel, not triumphant, deeply sad, is the correct response to what she was watching. She understood what she was seeing. She had learned enough from him to understand it, and she sentenced him anyway. Not because he was purely a villain, because he was genuinely dangerous, because all the real grief and all the genuine love had been bent over decades into something that harmed everyone it touched. Because you can understand the wound someone carries and still understand that the wound has been converted into a weapon, and weapons have to be taken out of circulation. That's not cruelty, that's clarity. And it's the most emotionally sophisticated thing the finale did. So where does that leave us? Here's my honest assessment, and I'll stand behind it. The downfall of Pater Baelish is simultaneously one of the most thematically satisfying endings in Game of Thrones and one of the most technically mishandled executions of a major character arc the show ever produced. The meaning is right. The psychology is right. The symmetry. Man destroyed by the one thing his system couldn't account for, brought down by the specific information weapon he had taught his opponent to use, is exactly right. If you read the ending as pure thematic statement, it is close to perfect. But the pacing is broken. The sisters' arc in Season 7 is structurally dishonest in a way the show didn't quite recover from. The diminishment of Littlefinger's operational intelligence over the preceding 2 seasons meant that the final act of the show's most sophisticated schemer looked less like the fall of a titan and more like the exposure of a mid-level operator who had gotten sloppy. The show gave us the right ending wrapped in the wrong story to get there. And if you want to see what the right story looks like, the version where Sansa and Pater arrive at their reckoning through years of accumulated truth, where his fall comes not from a rushed Season 7 plot arc, but from the slow, inevitable unraveling of a man who built everything on the foundation that was always going to betray him. Martin is still writing it. He is still writing it. That ending is not finished yet, and when it comes, if it comes, it will be the thing this analysis has been pointing toward all along, the moment when the one real thing Petyr Baelish ever felt becomes the last thing he ever was. The climb doesn't end, not really. It just becomes vertical.
Here's what I want you to sit with. Petyr Baelish spent his entire life proving that love is a vulnerability, that people who act from genuine feelings rather than strategy eventually get destroyed by it. And he was right over and over again for 40 years. But the proof that eventually destroyed him wasn't that he was wrong about other people. It was that he was wrong about himself. He thought he had converted his love for Catelyn into something purely functional. He thought the grief had been alchemized into strategy. He thought the wound had healed into armor. It hadn't. It never had. There was still something alive in there that couldn't be strategized, that looked at Sansa and saw Catelyn and made choices, protective choices, irrational choices, choices he could not fully explain in terms of leverage and advantage, that no purely strategic operator would have made. He kept her alive when strategy might have argued against it. He moved her out of King's Landing when he could have used her as a piece on someone else's board. He chose again and again to preserve the one person in the world he genuinely couldn't see clearly. And that choice, in the end, is what killed him. Not because Sansa was ungrateful, not because the world is cruel to those who love, but because the person he had shaped, educated, and kept safe had grown into someone capable of seeing him clearly, precisely because he had taught her how. He made her sharp enough to see his game. He made her safe enough to act on what she saw. He loved her into being the person who ended him. That is not a villain's death. That is a tragedy. The mockingbird sang, and the realm burned, and at the end of it, kneeling on cold stones in the castle of the family he had spent his whole life trying to matter to, what he found was not a scheme, and not a strategy, and not a ladder. Just the truth he had been running from. Just the one thing he could never turn into leverage. Just her name.